On the evening of 3rd September 1939, the very day that Neville Chamberlain announced that a state of war existed between Germany and Great Britain, the passenger ship SS Athenia suffered a devastating explosion on her port side. She had been attacked by the German submarine U-30. The German Navy had fired the first shot in the Battle of the Atlantic, and Britain and her allies were at war with the U-boat. The vast battlefield was to be the site of the longest continual battle of the Second World War. The conflict was not simply a duel between ships and submarines. Aircraft were also to play a vital role. The battle was to enter a new tactical arena, initiate huge technical advances, and redefine the rules of naval warfare. As an island nation, Great Britain had always relied on merchant shipping for trade and supplies, a fact that her enemies had long recognized. It was no different in 1939, and merchant ships bound for British ports became targets for the U-boats. Germany's aim was to devastate British supply routes in order to bring Britain to her knees. Germany's clandestine U-boat building program, in direct contravention of the Treaty of Versailles, had given Admiral Karl Dönitz, chief of the German submarine force, a fleet of some 57 vessels at the outbreak of war. While not sufficient to mount a wide-ranging attack, it was more than adequate to inflict significant losses on British merchant shipping in the early stages of the war. A clever tactician, Dönitz constantly developed his strategy to maximize his small force's operational effectiveness. As more U-boats came out of the yards, Dönitz was able to expand his field of operations and range far further than British coastal waters.
Submarines are by nature lone hunters, and initially Dönitz used them to act independently in areas where Allied shipping was bound to turn up. In the early stages of the war, these tended to be the western approaches to the United Kingdom or in the North Sea. As Allied responses became more successful and as more U-boats became available, Dönitz moved them further west and deeper into the Atlantic. After the fall of France, when the ports of the French Atlantic coast became available, he pushed this boundary much further west. By that stage, U-boats could operate almost to the North American coastline. When the United States entered the war, submarines were deployed as far south as the Caribbean, with notable success. But to remain effective for long periods, U-boats operating in these distant waters had to be resupplied regularly. Initially, this was achieved by the use of disguised merchant ships. Thanks to good intelligence, the Allies soon located and destroyed these hidden enemies. Dönitz then had to turn to the Milchcow supply submarines for replenishing supplies. Dönitz claimed that the tactic of the wolf pack was his own invention, but in fact such methods had been used to attack Allied shipping in the First World War. However, Dönitz developed the concept much further, especially when he was able to deploy over 40 U-boats into the Atlantic at any one time. In practice, this meant intelligence sources would identify a convoy of Allied merchant ships and its track could be assessed. Dönitz would then order as many U-boats as practical to lie in its path. This could be as many as 12 submarines, or even more. This force, or wolf pack, would be given a code name and a commander would be chosen. If the plan worked, as it did on many occasions, then the convoy would be attacked as it entered the area, with the sheer number of U-boats overwhelming the escorts. U-boats proved most effective when attacking at night. During daylight, they shadowed the convoy on the surface. As darkness descended, the submarine would submerge and find a suitable position for the attack. Braver commanders would go within the convoy itself. Ideally, a commander would find a position from which a salvo of torpedoes could be launched at a cluster of targets. Should one of the salvo miss its first target, there would be a reasonable chance that it would hit a second or even third. This firing solution was very hard to create, and usually a commander would have to be content with firing at one target, then changing position before the escort could react. He might have time to launch a second spread at another target or part of the convoy. Using these techniques, a U-boat could hit 2 or 3 targets before the attack had to be abandoned. In effect, the Germans simply used their U-boats as torpedo boats, which could only submerge for short periods. The main objective of the Allies in the Battle of the Atlantic was to get merchant ships into British ports unscathed. If merchant ships were to sail alone, they would be easy prey for German submarines. Even if ships were armed, they would be able to do little against a torpedo attack from a submerged U-boat. The only ships that could sail alone were the large passenger liners like the two Cunard Queens, which relied on their speed for protection. Other merchant ships were grouped together into a convoy. A convoy could consist of 60 ships, although most were about 40 strong. They were either fast at about 15 knots or slow at perhaps 10 knots. Convoys were identified by a code that was based on their destination or origin. For example, in the early days, OA coded convoys sailed from the south coast ports, OB from Liverpool, OG convoys went to Gibraltar. Later, the coding system was changed to make life more difficult for the Germans and to reflect the much more complex pattern of convoy use. Ideally, convoys would be escorted, but such was the shortage of escorts at the start of the war that most convoys could only be given naval protection as far as 12 degrees west. Before and after that line, they were on their own. Even if they did have an escort, it would probably be an armed merchant cruiser, plus perhaps one or two destroyers or trawlers. As more escorts became available, the limit of protection was moved further west until it reached the North American coastline. By late 1941, a convoy could expect to have perhaps 4 or even 6 escort vessels. By 1943, enough vessels existed for some of them to be formed into escort groups that would roam the North Atlantic, ready to reinforce the escorts of convoys under attack, or even go hunting U-boats at will. A convoy could also have 1 or 2 rescue ships attached to it, to release escorts or merchant ships from the obligation of rescuing survivors from ships that had sunk. If an escorted convoy came under attack, the escort ships would attempt to find and destroy the submarine. U-boats could be located using ASDIC apparatus and attacked using depth charges, that is, bombs set to explode at preset depths underwater using pressure detonators. The escort would try to sail over the submarine and drop its charges over the stern onto the target. Later, depth charge throwers were fitted to ships that enabled them to use a wider pattern of charges. The depth charges could damage the submarine enough for it to be forced to the surface and be sunk by gunfire, or even by ramming. This latter was discouraged, as it often put the escort out of action as well, and on one occasion the ramming ship, an American destroyer, was sunk with all the crew on board. A well-aimed depth charge could sink a U-boat underwater, although the preferred effect was to explode a charge on either side of the submarine, thus crushing its hull in between. If an aircraft were to find a U-boat on the surface, it would try to force the submarine to dive and drop its depth charges just as the U-boat slid beneath the surface, when it was at its most vulnerable. Such was the success rate that Dönitz ordered U-boat commanders to remain on the surface and engage the attacking aircraft using their anti-aircraft guns. Some even managed to shoot down their assailants, but this was rare. Most U-boats lost, and Dönitz soon changed his mind. Both sides soon realized that intelligence was critical to the battle. The Allies needed to know where the U-boats were, and the Germans had to know the routes of the convoys. Both sides began with little intelligence. The Admiralty turned to the use of signals intelligence. For this, it needed an efficient intelligence gathering center and an organization that could process the information quickly and send it to where it was needed. The Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park was already using intercepts from U-boats and U-boat HQ to work out the location of enemy submarines. This information was passed to the Naval Intelligence Division's Submarine Tracking Room, where senior commanders were advised on where and when convoys should be rerouted. The only problem was that Bletchley Park could not instantly decode information without access to the German codes and the Enigma machine, which coded and decoded the information. To solve this problem, the Admiralty encouraged Allied ships' crews to try and capture an Enigma machine. In May 1941, convoy OB-318 was attacked. 7 U-boats were involved, including U-110, commanded by Julius Lemp, the man who had sunk the Athenia. During the attack, U-110 was badly damaged and surfaced. Lemp ordered the crew to abandon the ship and scuttle the submarine. But the scuttling did not go according to plan, and the U-boat didn't sink immediately. A British boarding party from HMS Bulldog went on board and discovered that neither the Enigma machine nor its codebooks had been destroyed. When these were removed and sent to the UK, the Admiralty was overjoyed. By a clever use of subterfuge, the British also managed to convince the Germans that U-110 had sunk, taking all her secrets with her. When this information was combined with improvements in direction-finding techniques, such as high-frequency systems, HFDF, known as HFDUF, it gave the British a significant advantage. But the Allies still had one problem. They needed to train people to use the technology and to interpret it. This took time. Time that the Allies did not have. There was also the temptation with the Enigma information to use it immediately to hunt U-boats. While this could have saved ships and lives, it would surely have told the Germans that the codes had been cracked. The information had to be used very carefully. Once the Allies' ability to read U-boat signals became known, the Germans added a 4th rotor to their Enigma machines. It took until the 13th of December 1942 before Bletchley Park managed to break the new system, although it was still to be some time before the Allies were confident that the information they were getting was accurate. The Germans had their equivalent in intelligence gathering, but it never quite matched the successes of the Allies. Their radio observation service, known as B-Dienst, managed to gather significant successes in the early stages of the war by using Allied radio traffic interception to identify the nature and whereabouts of Allied convoys. The Germans cracked Allied codes. This was most notable in the case of the Admiralty's Naval Cipher No. 3, which B-Dienst broke in early 1942. This enabled the Germans to read some 80% of signals sent using this code. It was early in 1943 before the Allies realized this had happened, and a new naval cipher, No. 5, was introduced. The Germans never succeeded in breaking this. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun with the sinking of the Athenia. A month later, the full potential of the U-boat was revealed. On the 13th of October, Gunther Prien in U-47 entered the naval base of Scapa Flow in the Orkneys and sank the battleship Royal Oak while she lay at anchor. 786 British sailors died. In that first autumn of the war, German submarines also sank the aircraft carrier HMS Courageous and attacked the battleships Nelson and Rodney, and the battlecruiser Hood, pride of the Royal Navy. Yet Dönitz knew right from the start that he did not have the resources he needed to conduct an effective submarine war in the North Atlantic. By the 3rd of September 1939, he had 57 U-boats at his disposal. Not enough to be effective. He also had other problems. Hitler was initially reluctant to introduce unrestricted submarine warfare, as he feared the impact it would have amongst neutral countries. Hitler also insisted that German submarines follow the prize rules, whereby the submarine commander had to confirm that the target was a legitimate one before it could be sunk or captured. The problem with this approach was that the submarine would have to surface and make itself more vulnerable to counterattack. Dönitz was also far from convinced that the torpedoes the U-boats carried were reliable enough. This was borne out when torpedoes failed to explode or went astray, as happened when HMS Hood was attacked. But one thing his experience of the First World War had taught Dönitz was that all that mattered was tonnage. His submarines needed to sink Allied merchant ships at a greater rate than they could be replaced by new ones. If this happened, then Britain could be starved into surrender. If it didn't happen, then Britain could only be defeated by invasion. Successes against large warships like the Royal Oak and the Courageous were excellent advertisements for the potential of the U-boat. But Dönitz argued that the real campaign should be against the merchant ships, which kept Britain fed and fueled and able to fight. Dönitz convinced his commander-in-chief, Grand Admiral Reeder, that 300 U-boats were needed to guarantee success. Hitler appreciated the argument but stopped short of giving the U-boat force his top priority. The German army still lay at the root of Hitler's belief in victory, and Goering argued convincingly for more resources for his air force. So it was well into 1940 before Dönitz even began to receive new submarines in the numbers he needed. But this didn't stop him from beginning an aggressive campaign immediately, and once more using his World War I experience, he lost no time in introducing his Wolfpack tactics. In the meantime, the British introduced the convoy system that had turned the campaign in the Allies' favour 22 years earlier. This was largely forced on the British, who believed that the sinking of the liner Athenia heralded an early return to unrestricted submarine warfare. But the British were short of escort ships, suitable aircraft, and modern technology such as ASDIC and radar. It also took time to put the convoys together, and while the convoys were being organised, the U-boats pounced on unescorted merchant ships. British anti-submarine tactics were also confused. The Royal Navy's natural philosophy was to attack the enemy, not defend convoys. So escort groups were formed to go out and find U-boats. The British had neither the ships nor the training and experience to do this, and in the beginning even used large fleet aircraft carriers as part of these groups. The loss of HMS Courageous while on an anti-submarine patrol helped convince the Admiralty that this tactic was suicidal. The groups were also rediscovering how elusive submarines can be, as mile upon mile of ocean was examined with little success. The Royal Navy soon reverted to providing convoy escorts. So quite early in the campaign, the battle between the Wolfpack and the convoy was joined. Dönitz's first effort was not a success, however. He had hoped to bring together 9 boats to concentrate on an attack against a convoy in October 1939. But unserviceability, enemy action and other priorities reduced this to 3 when convoy HG3 was sighted on the 17th. Only 3 merchant ships were lost before the U-boats were forced to withdraw. Dönitz realized that his force would have to be significantly bigger if the tactic was to succeed. He released his submarines so they could return to independent operations. But by this time he had achieved one success. He had persuaded Hitler to relax the prize rules so ships could be attacked at will. However, Hitler would still not allocate the resources Dönitz needed for his 300-boat fleet. The first phase of the Battle of the Atlantic was inconclusive. The Germans did not have enough submarines to be truly effective, and the British lacked the numbers of escorts. But both sides were active. German submarine production was increasing, although initially not fast enough to provide replacements for U-boats lost. They were also working hard to improve the reliability of their torpedoes. And the British were busy converting old warships and suitable merchant ships into escorts, as well as ordering new ones. Both sides claimed successes, but if anything it was the British who had won the first round, by a very narrow margin. 17 U-boats had been sunk, and the convoys were getting through, mostly unscathed. This situation was not to last. The capture of the French ports following the fall of France was vital to the U-boat campaign. On the 23rd of June 1940, a convoy of trucks left Wilhelmshaven loaded with submarine spares, weapons and equipment. They were bound for Lorient in southern Brittany, where the first French U-boat base was being established. Shortly afterwards, Dönitz commandeered a villa in nearby Kerneval. This became his headquarters, and from here he and his staff directed the U-boat war. Bases were also set up at Brest, Saint-Nazaire and La Pallice. Now U-boats could sail straight into the Atlantic without the long voyage from their bases in Germany. It meant submarines were able to stay on patrol for longer, and more submarines were available at any one time. Soon, massive concrete pens were built to protect U-boats from aerial bombing while they were undergoing maintenance in port. The failure of the RAF to bomb such bases while the pens were being built was to prove a costly mistake. Using his new geographical advantages, Dönitz returned to his idea of using submarines in a pack. 6 boats were placed under the command of Gunther Prien, the man who sank the Royal Oak, and 5 boats were assigned to Hans Rosing. The concept was good, but still there were problems of communications, and both the target convoys arrived at their destinations unscathed. Dönitz then decided to attack independent ships, and during June 1940, his U-boats sank 58 victims. Only a fifth of them were in convoy. The British were worried. By summer 1940, the fear of invasion was diverting escorts into the areas around the English Channel. This meant that convoy escorts were reduced, in some cases, to just 1 ship. The fall of France had also enabled German long-range bombers to attack British shipping in the southwest approaches, where a combination of U-boats and aircraft sank the liner Empress of Britain. So the British moved their convoy routes to the northwest. This, however, made them vulnerable to short-range U-boats operating from bases in Norway. The British did have one advantage, although not of their making. Continued rivalry between Dönitz and Göring meant that there were never enough German long-range aircraft available to provide reconnaissance patrols. The Luftwaffe was heavily engaged in the Battle of Britain, and Göring had little time for the Atlantic campaign, which he brushed off as merely a sideshow. Most of the cards, however, still lay with the Germans. U-boats based in France could now operate as far west as 25 degrees west. British escorts could only reach 17 degrees, and Coastal Command's Sunderlands could only provide cover out to 15 degrees. The British had to find an answer. One solution was to increase the number of escorts. In the long term, they could be built, but in the short term, Churchill would have to persuade Roosevelt to lend Britain 40 old destroyers. They were ill-equipped, possessed poor seakeeping qualities, and they needed to be adapted for anti-submarine operations. But they came. Throughout the autumn of 1940, the U-boats gained the upper hand. Attacking on the surface at night, they started to cause losses which the British found hard to sustain. Escort tactics were poor, and the Germans were learning quickly. Convoys were attacked at night. The U-boats would shadow by day and attack again the next night. Some very successful U-boat commanders, such as Prien and Otto Kretschmer, became household names back in Germany and were accorded the status of aces. This was very much part of Dönitz's astute public relations campaign. That is, convince the public of the U-boat's success, and the Nazi leadership will have to give the force more resources. In October 1940, convoy SC-7 left Halifax for Liverpool. It lost 17 ships out of 35. In the same month, convoy HX-79 lost 14 ships, and HX-79A lost 7. In the space of less than a week, 38 merchant ships had been sunk by U-boats. No wonder the Germans called this period the happy time. Britain responded in 3 ways. Escorts were released from anti-submarine duties. They were given radar, and more aircraft were provided as older bombers, replaced by newer models in Bomber Command, were released to Coastal Command. Tactically, there were changes as escorts were told not to leave the convoys unescorted as they chased contacts, often spurious, all over the seas. The convoy was never to be left unprotected. Slowly, these measures began to take effect, and there were successes for the escorts. But the reduction in losses to U-boat attack in the late 1940 was more due to submarine unserviceability and bad weather than new British tactics. To compensate for the bad weather, the U-boats moved south, where they found rich pickings in the shipping off the West African coast, where escorts were non-existent. During the winter of 1940-41, the Allies started to fight back. The big reorganization in the command and control structure, which saw the creation of new, partly unified commands and the better use of joint intelligence, started to have an impact. Losses were still happening, but proportionately they were less than in the desperate autumn of 1940. Even the aces began to encounter more resolute defenses as they attacked. In March 1942, Prien himself was lost when attacking convoy OB-293. Kretschmer surrendered after being forced to surface and scuttle U-99. A third ace, Joachim Schepke, was crushed between the bow of HMS Vanok and his own periscope, as his U-boat was rammed and sunk. These losses were a serious blow to Dönitz, especially as they meant that 5 U-boats had been lost in 3 weeks for the exchange rate of 15 Allied merchant ships. This loss rate was unsustainable, and Dönitz was still suffering from a lack of available submarines. He decided to change tactics. In April 1941, Dönitz decided to move his 9 operational deep-sea U-boats further west to establish a patrol line at 30 degrees. This soon reaped dividends when convoy SC-26 lost 11 ships. The cost to the Germans was 1 U-boat. This forced the British to develop further the facilities on Iceland, particularly the airfields. Sunderlands and Hudsons were sent to the island and helped to push the protection screen further west. But the problem remained that there were not enough escorts or long-range aircraft available to provide the necessary cover. The capture of the Enigma machine offered the Allies some respite, but again it was to be some time before the full impact of the capture could be assessed and the information it released used. This and other technical advances needed time. Operators and assessors had to be trained, and experience had to be gained. However, one advantage to the British was now beginning to produce results. The increasingly obvious support for the British by the Americans had not only led to the lease of the 40 old destroyers, but also to the Americans themselves becoming more involved. As early as October 1939, the Americans had declared a security zone around the coastline of the United States. This meant that British shipping was safe from attack while in the zone. On the 10th of April 1941, President Roosevelt said that the safety zone would be moved from 60 degrees west to 26 degrees west. At the same time, he announced that British warships could be repaired and refitted in American dockyards. This blatant abuse of the neutrality rules meant that the security zone now stretched 2,300 nautical miles across the Atlantic and included the Azores. It was inevitable that U-boats would become more and more confused about where they could operate and who the enemy was, especially when American warships were seen to be escorting British convoys within the neutrality zone. Mistakes occurred. American warships were attacked, and one, the USS Reuben James, was sunk with heavy loss of life. More American merchant ships were also being attacked, usually by accident, but in some cases deliberately. Hitler had to issue a direct command to stop German U-boats targeting Americans. He was still desperately worried about provoking the United States into war. Things were getting bad for the Germans, and Dönitz was infuriated at what he saw as blatant interference by a neutral state. By the summer of 1941, he was also concerned at increasing losses amongst the German supply ships, which were maintaining and resupplying submarines in the more distant waters. These losses were the first tangible benefits of the cracking of the German codes by Bletchley Park. In June, things became even worse for the Germans, as President Roosevelt ordered American forces to occupy Iceland. Within a few months, the island had become a very well-equipped and well-defended Allied base, instead of merely being the home to a few RAF Coastal Command squadrons. But still, Hitler refused to react. And in August 1941, a U-boat was actually captured almost fully intact by a combination of surface escorts and RAF Coastal Command aircraft based in Iceland. Unfortunately, the crew of U-570 managed to destroy their secret equipment and documents before their ship was boarded. After being thoroughly examined, the U-boat was taken into the Royal Navy and named HMS Graf. By the end of 1941, the situation was improving significantly for the British. Dönitz was still chronically short of U-boats. Allied anti-submarine equipment and experience were improving, and the growing American involvement was having an effect. At the same time, Hitler ordered Dönitz to send his valuable submarines to support the campaigns against the Russians and in the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean, some very visible successes were achieved. The legendary aircraft carrier Ark Royal was sunk, and the old battleship Barham was destroyed most spectacularly by U-331. But Dönitz knew that these would not win the war. The Japanese attacked the US Pacific Fleet's base at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands on the 7th of December 1941. But the United States had been in conflict with Germany for some time before Germany officially declared war on the 11th of December. The Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Harold Stark, admitted this when he said, "We are at war," in October 1941, following the sinking of the Reuben James. Following the official declaration, however, the situation in the North Atlantic became much clearer, and Dönitz, who knew the implications of US entry, could at least recognize who the enemy was. But he realized that in the long term, American war production would be crucial to his idea of a tonnage war. He calculated that just over 800,000 tons would have to be sunk each month if his campaign was to succeed. The figures for the last 6 months of 1941 did not give him much cause for optimism. Only 120,000 was being sunk each month. At last, U-boat production was beginning to pick up. Dönitz had 91 U-boats available in January 1942. By July, this had increased to 138. This still meant he had nowhere near enough. Many boats would be in maintenance, on training duties, or still working up to operational fitness. So on the 1st of January 1942, Dönitz was only able to deploy 6 boats against the United States. This did not stop him. He began the campaign almost immediately. He called it Operation Paukenschlag, or Operation Drumbeat. He told the 6 commanders to avoid convoys and operate independently. Attempts were made to track the submarines, but bad weather and operational difficulties meant that the information available to the Allies was inconclusive. On the 12th of January, U-123 found the first victim. In all, the operation accounted for 41 merchant ships, for no German losses. It was the second happy time. The Americans, despite their already significant experience, were totally unprepared. Many of their escorts had been sent to the Pacific. The ones that remained were poorly equipped and manned by inexperienced crews. Ironically, the best anti-submarine units available were 7 US Coast Guard cutters. It was perhaps now a source of regret that many of the ships the Americans could have used had already been sent to Britain under Lend-Lease arrangements. Admiral King would not introduce convoys until he had the ships to escort them. This was against all the advice of the British, who had experienced similar problems themselves 2 years earlier. But King refused to accept British advice, nor did the American Eastern Sea Frontier Command have the aircraft it needed. These had been seconded to fleet protection, and in any case, many of them were under the control of the Army Air Force, with whom the Navy did not work well. To help, the British temporarily lent the Americans 10 corvettes and 24 trawlers until US forces became available. The Americans realized quickly that things would have to improve and set about producing new command and control systems to enable all the parties to work together more closely. At last, they began to learn the lessons of the British experience. They also began a huge construction program. But the U-boats continued their deadly work. They moved south into the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. They even surfaced and used their deck guns to shell oil installations ashore. The American reaction was poor. Even when U-boats were located, inexperienced escort crews lost them or failed to press home their attacks. On one occasion, a merchant ship opened fire on an American destroyer, believing her to be a U-boat. The destroyer's captain and 2 sailors were killed. The British tried and tried to convince Admiral King to introduce convoys, but still he refused, believing that a convoy not escorted properly would be a bigger liability than merchant ships sailing individually. The British also tried to get the Americans to shift priorities from the Pacific to the Atlantic. While this was going on, the Germans continued to exact a heavy toll off the eastern seaboard of the United States, where ships were often sunk within visual distance of the coast. No blackout had been introduced. This made spotting merchant ships much easier for the U-boats, as they were silhouetted against the lights of the cities. By March, things were beginning to improve as new escorts began to arrive, but it was still May 1942 before the Americans began to convoy ships down the east coast and into the Gulf. Once this happened, the number of easy targets for the U-boats began to decline, and so Dönitz turned his attention back to the North Atlantic convoys and reintroduced his wolf packs. He still had to attain his required number of sinkings to keep his tonnage war on track. Despite improvements to the American anti-submarine capability, the demands of the Pacific drew more and more resources into it, leaving the Battle of the Atlantic to the British and the Canadians. A mid-ocean escort force was formed based in Newfoundland, which would take convoys straight from Newfoundland to the coast of Ireland. More new escorts were entering service, including the first of the new purpose-built super corvettes, which became known as frigates. But as new ships entered the fray, their lack of experience became critical. This was especially true in the case of the Royal Canadian Navy, that had expanded from almost nothing to provide 33% of the escort vessels in a matter of 18 months. It was not surprising that the Canadians were not as competent as they were expected to be. The convoy battle was rejoined with a new fervour, and the Atlantic War was about to reach its most critical phase. The climax of the Battle of the Atlantic was reached in the early spring of 1943. But there were already signs that the campaign was entering its most crucial phase as soon as the German U-boats rejoined the battle against the North Atlantic convoys in the summer of 1942. Admiral Pound, the first Sea Lord, realized that Dönitz would have to put almost all his effort into the North Atlantic if he was to win. At the beginning of this phase, the British were still suffering from a shortage of escorts, not helped by the dispatch of 2 escort groups to the United States waters. Admiral Pound's belief that this was leaving the North Atlantic too exposed seemed to be confirmed in July, when convoy ON-113 encountered a large force of U-boats. In the ensuing battle, a U-boat was sunk and the rest driven off thanks to a well-coordinated defense. However, 3 merchant ships were lost. The determination and tactics of the defending forces moved Dönitz to broadcast to the German people, telling them to prepare for heavy losses. In early August, he sent a pack in to attack convoy SC-94. 2 U-boats were sunk, but not before a third of the convoy had been destroyed. The Allies realized that there had to be a change of tactics. The first of these was the creation of the Escort Support Group, a squadron of fast escorts which could go to the aid of a convoy under threat. The first of them, the 20th, was commanded by Commander E.F. Johnny Walker, a name which became synonymous with the victory in the Atlantic, as did that of his flagship, the sloop HMS Starling. Like all good ideas, however, it took some time to reach fruition, and the escort groups were not to be effective for some 6 months. The continuing problem of air cover was also being addressed both by increasing the number of very long-range aircraft available and by providing ships which could carry short-range aircraft, the MAC and the escort carrier. A further change in Allied tactics, made possible by the number of long-range aircraft, was taking the battle to the enemy, attacking the submarines while they were on transit into or out of their secure bases on the west coast of France. Air-mounted radars and the Lee light made this possible even at night. Early successes in the Battle of the Bay were encouraging. Not many U-boats were sunk, but submarine commanders realized they were vulnerable at night and so had to transit the Bay of Biscay underwater, adding to their patrol times. This also had the knock-on effect of the Germans allocating long-range Ju-88 fighters to the west of France, hoping to shoot down the Allied anti-submarine aircraft. The British reply to introduce the long-range Beaufighter into the campaign proved more than a match for the Germans. The war against the convoys continued. Convoy ONS-154 sailed into a force of 20 U-boats in December 1942. 14 merchant ships were lost for 1 U-boat. TM-1, a tanker convoy, left Trinidad bound for Gibraltar. It lost 77% of its ships, without sinking even 1 U-boat. These losses forced Churchill and Roosevelt to make the Battle of the Atlantic their priority. Although the Torch landings in North Africa had been a success, the real victory would involve a landing in Europe. For this to be successful, vast amounts of men and munitions would have to be massed in Britain prior to the invasion. Much of these would have to come across the Atlantic, and if they were to do so successfully, Disasters like ONS 154 and TM1 had to be avoided. The appalling weather of January 1943 gave the convoys some respite from attack, but it was short. In February, SC-118 lost 13 ships at a cost to the Germans of 3 U-boats sunk and 4 badly damaged. In the same month, convoy ON-166 was attacked by 21 U-boats. 14 merchant ships were lost, 2 U-boats sunk. But the Allies were learning. The climax of the Battle of the Atlantic revolved around 4 convoys: SC-121, SC-122, HX-228, and HX-229. SC-121 was attacked by 2 packs totaling 24 submarines. The convoy's escort was weak, and 13 ships were lost. As a result, HX-228, which sailed a few days later, was ordered to move south. Although it was spotted, it had a heavy escort, which included an escort carrier, USS Bogue. The battle was chaotic, but only 4 merchant ships and 1 destroyer had been sunk. 2 U-boats were also lost. The other 2 convoys, SC-122 and HX-229, were attacked almost simultaneously and suffered severe losses. They were only saved from catastrophe by the arrival of Coastal Command aircraft. But still, 22 ships were sunk for the loss of 1 U-boat. Dönitz was jubilant, and the Allies desperate. For the first time, it seemed that communications between North America and Great Britain could be severed. But actually, the lessons of these 4 convoys on deeper analysis revealed that at last the Allied effort in providing more escorts and long-range aircraft were beginning to work. The number of U-boats used was huge, and proportionately, the Allied losses were not that high. It was difficult to understand this when the North Atlantic seemed full of sinking ships, but the operational analysis teams were far from pessimistic. They believed the Allies were on the verge of success. Between the 4th and 7th of April, an attack took place against convoy HX-231. 3 ships were sunk, but 2 U-boats were destroyed and another 4 badly damaged. On the 29th of April, convoy ONS-5 ran into the largest wolf pack of the war, 40 U-boats. 1 ship was sunk that night. On the 4th of May, 6 ships were sunk. The following day, 7 more. But the U-boats were decimated. 8 were sunk and 5 very badly damaged. Dönitz called off the attack. Losses on this scale were unbearable. 2 weeks later, he tried again. On the 16th of May, convoy HX-237 made it to Liverpool, having lost just 3 merchant ships. 3 U-boats had been sunk. Convoy SC-130, whose escort was commanded by Commander Peter Gretton, who was due to get married at the end of the voyage, ran into 33 U-boats. In the ensuing battle, not 1 merchant ship was sunk, but 5 U-boats had been destroyed, 1 containing Lieutenant Peter Dönitz, the Commander-in-Chief's son. Gretton got married. At last, all the Allied assets, land, sea, air, intelligence, technology and training had come together. The result had been the destruction of 31 U-boats in little over a month. On the 24th of May, Dönitz ordered his boats out of the North Atlantic. He assured them that this was a temporary setback. But he, like most of his crews, suspected the battle was lost. In May 1943, the U-boats were beaten. But the battle did not end, nor was it to do so until the last day of the war. But they were never to threaten the North Atlantic in the same way again. From now on, they would deploy singly and attack targets of opportunity. As such, they were constantly a threat to Allied operations and were sinking Allied ships right up until the end of the war. But the existing submarines had been outpaced by technology. By the middle of 1943, the Type 7 and 9 U-boats were no match for the combination of ships, aircraft, detection systems, and weapons the Allies were putting into service. By the time the new technology U-boats were entering the conflict in late 1944, the war was all but over. By 1944, also, many U-boats were being destroyed before they could enter service, as Allied bombers attacked the shipyards. The Allies continued to hunt and destroy submarines wherever possible. But after the spring of 1943, it became a battle of aggression, not of defense. New long-range aircraft, protected by long-range fighters, took the fight deep into the Bay of Biscay. And on the 20th of June, Captain Walker took his escort group into the bay to work with the aircraft. His primary target was the supply of milch cow submarines, which were enabling U-boats to operate in many areas away from the North Atlantic. Together, they sank 2. Within a few months, almost all the milch cows had been destroyed. Unfortunately, Walker himself died shortly afterwards, the victim of a heart attack. Dönitz grasped at the new technologies available to him. He was particularly impressed by the NAT homing torpedo, which had some success against convoys as early as September 1943. They were particularly effective against escorts until the Allies worked out deception and decoy techniques. Dönitz continued to deploy submarines against convoys, but the loss rates were heavy and the effect decreasing. Intelligence rerouted convoys, and by October, U-boats were struggling to find targets. On the 16th of November, Dönitz withdrew the U-boats for a second time. From then until the end of the war, the German submarine became an irritant rather than a threat. In November and December 1943, 72 convoys reached their destinations without the loss of a single ship to submarine attack. American shipyards were completing new cargo ships at the rate of 1 a day. A 10,000-ton Liberty ship could be welded together in 10 days. One was even built in 4. The first ones were unreliable and could even break in half in rough weather. The later ones brought the munitions, the fuel, the food, and the weapons that the Allies needed for the invasion of Europe.
Today, the shipyards of North America sound their answer in the clang of hammers. New ships to release British merchantmen for service in the Atlantic. And along Canada's coasts and rivers, the corvettes take the water to help Britain's hard-pressed destroyers keep that vital supply line open. Already the tide of battle may be turning. Already the wide Atlantic is becoming a graveyard for the raiders themselves. Yet the final answer lies not alone in ships. Hitler himself has said, "It is not arms that decide, but the men behind them." And behind these men of Churchill's Island lies 1,000 years of the sea in peace and war, in calm and storm. Because of them, the convoys plow on and Britain's lifeline holds.
The tonnage war had been lost. Within a year, the bases in France were being evacuated, and the losses of U-boats and their accompanying vessels in this operation was little better than carnage. In their last operations in the Baltic, the situation was even worse. 83 U-boats were sunk in the last 5 weeks of the war, almost all to aircraft. On the 4th of May, the second Führer of Nazi Germany, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, ordered all the remaining U-boats to cease operations. 3 days later, the war against Germany formally ended. The surrender was signed by Karl Dönitz. Despite the great hopes of Dönitz, the U-boats did not win the war for the Germans. There were never enough U-boats for the battle. Dönitz and Reeder had agreed that the German Navy would need 300 submarines. By the time they had that number, it was too late, and the battle was lost. The successes of the large packs, however, at the height of the campaign, demonstrated what could have been achieved if the numbers had been there. The escorts could have been completely swamped. The ability of the Allies to build new escorts and merchant ships to replace those sunk had been underestimated. The Germans might have succeeded if the Americans had stayed out of the war, but as soon as they entered and the Liberty ships came rolling down the slipways, the tonnage war was doomed. The Allies also were able to use advances in technology much more quickly. They introduced radar, new detection devices, long-range aircraft, better weapons and better intelligence. The Third Reich built 1,162 U-boats. 830 took part in operations. 784 were lost. Of the 41,000 men who manned them, almost 26,000 were killed. 5,000, the lucky ones, were captured. 2,828 Allied and neutral merchant ships were sunk, almost 15 million tons. How many died in them will never be known. 30,000 British merchant sailors were killed in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Royal Navy lost 175 warships trying to protect them. 5,880 airmen and 2,000 Canadians died in the same cause. It was vital to the Allies that they won it. If they hadn't, Britain may not have survived to continue the war against the aggressor. Many of the battle's victims have no known grave, no headstone to commemorate their last resting place. But they cannot be forgotten. In December 1941, Japan went to war with the United States by launching a surprise attack against the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. In the following months, the Japanese ruthlessly overran American and Allied possessions in the Far East and Pacific Ocean. Yet by the spring of 1945, the tide of war had turned. A seemingly unstoppable American military whirlwind was thundering across the Pacific Ocean towards the shores of the Japanese home islands, threatening total defeat. There was a lot to lose. Japan had never been defeated in over 1,000 years and believed itself mandated by heaven to be a great power. Failure was incomprehensible. Despite the desperation of their position, Japan's leaders resolved to stop the American colossus at the gates. On the rugged island backwater of Okinawa, many believed that the superior will of Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen would triumph over American materialism and save Japan. As the last major fight against the Americans, Okinawa was as costly and as savage as the Japanese had intended. Yet the outcome of the battle and its consequences for Japan were to be far more catastrophic than her leaders could ever have imagined. On the 20th of November 1943, US Marine and Army forces, under the strategic direction of Admiral Chester Nimitz, invaded the outermost point of the Japanese defensive perimeter in the Pacific. The invasion of the Gilbert Islands was the first of the big American amphibious assaults in the Pacific. The bloody fighting on Tarawa demonstrated the ability of new American naval, air, and ground forces to attack and overwhelm almost at will any part of the Japanese defense line. The invasion of the Gilberts was the opening blow in what became a relentless drive by US forces across the Central Pacific. In January and February 1944, the Marshall Islands were secured. In June, American forces leapt forwards nearly 1,000 miles to secure Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the Marianas. In the South Pacific, forces under General Douglas MacArthur completed the liberation of New Guinea. In October 1944, Nimitz and MacArthur's forces combined to begin the invasion of the Philippines, with landings at Leyte Gulf. Once the initial objectives of this campaign were secured, Nimitz turned his attention to the final approaches to Japan. Formosa, now known as Taiwan, had been the intended objective of the next phase of the American advance, not Okinawa. A number of considerations led the Americans to cancel the Formosa invasion in preference for an attack against Okinawa and the Ryukyu Islands. Army and Navy planners began to realize that with no immediate prospect of troop reinforcements from the European War, existing Pacific Theater forces were inadequate for invading such a large and well-defended island as Formosa. On occupying the Marianas in July 1944, US planners realized these islands lacked adequate harbor and base facilities to support the immense naval and amphibious forces needed for the Formosa operation. Although it took time for commanders in the Pacific to convince Washington that the Formosa operation should be cancelled in favor of Okinawa, by early October, Nimitz had received orders to plan an invasion. Codenamed Iceberg, the invasion was scheduled for the 1st of March, 1945. Prior to launching Operation Iceberg, the tiny island of Iwo Jima was to be secured to protect the right flank and lines of communications of those forces involved. The Marines landed on Iwo Jima on the 19th of February, but the fanatical last stand of the 26,000-man garrison on this 8-square-mile island proved harder to overcome than anticipated. In the end, the 6 weeks of bloody fighting it took to secure the island, as well as delays in available shipping, prompted the invasion of Okinawa to be rescheduled for the 1st of April, 1945. Ominously, American casualties on Iwo Jima had totaled over 6,000 dead and 20,000 wounded. Only 1,000 Japanese, too wounded to commit suicide, had been captured. It seemed that despite their desperate situation, the Japanese will to resist was unbroken. Although the loss of Iwo Jima represented a major breach of the Japanese High Command's final inner defense zone for the home islands, it was only one part of a total collapse of Japan's strategic position across the Far East in the opening months of 1945. Japanese forces had been routed and driven from Burma by revitalized British Imperial forces. In the Philippines, only small and scattered Japanese resistance remained. In January 1945, US Navy carrier aircraft began regular large-scale strikes against targets in the Japanese home islands themselves. In March, P-51 Mustang fighter bombers from Iwo Jima joined this aerial assault. That same month, long-range B-29 Superfortress bombers, based in the Marianas, began devastating Japanese cities with incendiary attacks. At sea, American submarines and aircraft inflicted savage losses upon Japan's merchant navy. The imminent collapse of imports of raw materials threatened Japan's ability to continue the war by denying her the weapons to fight. Even more ominous were the resulting shortages in foodstuffs. Japan's leaders were acutely aware that by 1946, domestic food stocks would be exhausted. Faced with starvation, there was a very real possibility that the traditional social and political order of Japan would be turned upside down. In the face of this national collapse, Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo believed that only a decisive victory on Japanese soil could save the nation. What they needed was time to organize their remaining resources for the final decisive battle. The forces on Okinawa would be sacrificed to win time to organize the defense of the home islands. Okinawa would decide more than just the fate of a single island. It would decide the fate of Japan, her culture, and her people. In the struggle for Okinawa, the Americans relied upon a number of experienced naval and army officers. Many of these senior commanders had served in the hard campaigns of the early years of the war, when the Japanese had been in the ascendant. The overall planning and conduct of the Okinawa campaign was under the command of Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the United States Pacific Fleet and forces of the Pacific Ocean areas. After the devastation of Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Nimitz took control of a demoralized Pacific fleet. This modest, outwardly relaxed man from the Texan hill country soon set about establishing his reputation as a humane, inspirational, and aggressive leader. Arriving at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz rejected demands for a witch hunt of the fleet's personnel. Instead, he chose to heal the fleet's wounds and restore morale by immediately taking the war to the Japanese. In early 1942, US carrier forces attacked targets in the Central Pacific and, most impressively, Tokyo. At the Coral Sea and Midway, the US Navy halted Japanese expansion in the Pacific. In just 6 months, the quiet admiral had put a shattered navy on the road to victory. A submariner by trade, who never qualified to fly or command carriers, Nimitz developed a sound understanding of the critical role of aviation in modern warfare. He fully supported the creation of the fast carrier groups that became the main attack force of the Pacific Fleet. By 1944, Nimitz's revitalized fleet boldly drove across the Pacific, inflicting crushing defeats on the Japanese combined fleet at the battles of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. Nimitz never commanded at sea during the war, preferring to devolve command to trusted subordinates. A sound judge of character, he had a talent for selecting the right man for a job. When questions were raised about a commander's performance in action, he chose to make his own inquiries rather than trust the opinions of others. Although he commanded far from the battlefronts, Chester Nimitz was not a cold-hearted commander. Acutely aware of the human dimension of war, he regularly visited frontline positions to talk to soldiers, sailors, and airmen. One of the most capable and trusted of Nimitz's subordinates was 59-year-old Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance. For the Okinawa campaign, Spruance was placed in overall command of the 5th Fleet and the Central Pacific Task Forces. An odd man, outwardly cold and something of a hypochondriac, Spruance had a reputation for cool and detailed thinking. Originally a surface ship commander, on the outbreak of war, he found himself thrown into the new concept of carrier warfare. He swiftly demonstrated his abilities, achieving great success. In June 1942, he commanded the American carrier force that defeated the Japanese at the Battle of Midway. He then served as Nimitz's Chief of Operations before returning to Sea Command in late 1943. He oversaw the invasions of the Gilbert, Marshall and Mariana Island chains, but his failure to annihilate the Japanese fleet at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 attracted bitter criticism. Faced with a complex situation, Spruance fought with masterly logic, destroying the entire Japanese fleet air support in one day. Though Spruance shunned emotion and bombast, by 1945, in private, he fretted and worried. In letters to his wife, he confessed to sleeping badly. The strain of almost 18 months of conducting or planning operations, punctuated by infrequent periods of home leave, was taking its toll on the austere master of detail. The driving force propelling Spruance's fleet for the Okinawa invasion were the fast carriers of Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. These two commanders from different parts of the Navy developed a close and harmonious relationship over the course of the war. It had not always been so. Unimpressed by Mitcher's poor handling of the carrier Hornet at Midway, Spruance strongly opposed Nimitz's decision to promote his colleague to commander of the new fast carrier force in late 1943. As the war progressed, however, Mitcher proved his critics wrong, winning even Spruance's admiration. Mitcher's aggressive, courageous, and carefully calculated tactics smashed the Japanese in the Central Pacific and at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. By 1945, the man nicknamed Bald Eagle for his beaky, wizened face and intense watery blue eyes was the preeminent carrier commander of the Pacific War. Mitcher was a demanding battle commander. He instilled his carrier groups with an alert and keen edge by insisting that they always operate as if battle were imminent. Despite his slavish attention to detail, Mitcher gave his carrier commanders extensive scope to use their initiative. Setting the highest standards for himself, he expected the same in others. The Bald Eagle was a commander who needed to feel the pulse of action at close quarters. In the end, the strain he placed on his slight body during the war killed him in 1947. He was just 60 years old. If Mitcher was Spruance's right-hand man, then equally inseparable from the US Navy's success was the less attractive figure of Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. Commander of the Joint Expeditionary Task Force, Turner was responsible for planning and conducting the initial amphibious assault landing on Okinawa. Having overseen most of the previous landings in the Central Pacific, Turner was a natural choice. Commanding the US 10th Army during the Okinawa invasion was Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner. His subsequent conduct of the campaign generated strong criticism from contemporary Marine and naval officers. Born in Kentucky in 1886, he passed out middle of his West Point class in 1908. His pre-war experience involved training as a pilot and 2 appointments at West Point, the last as Commandant of Cadets. In 1940, he was promoted to brigadier and sent to Alaska, where he was responsible for directing operations in the harsh conditions of the Aleutian Islands campaign. In May 1943, he was sent to Hawaii to organize the 10th Army. Keen to be seen by his men, Buckner regularly went forwards to observe the fighting. During one of these visits, on the 18th of June, he was killed. In 1954, he was posthumously promoted to full general. The Japanese commanders, who struggled to save Okinawa and Japan in 1945, were motivated by seemingly contradictory factors. They were professional officers, utterly devoted to the service of Emperor Hirohito. Imbued with the ancient samurai code of Bushido, many preferred death at their own hands to the disgrace of capture. They fought fanatically to save Japan. Yet all but the most deluded harbored no doubts about the eventual outcome of the battle for Okinawa and the war as a whole. In a sense, they fought because they understood nothing else. 58-year-old Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima was given command of the 32nd Army on Okinawa in August 1944. In the early stages of the war, he had commanded troops in Burma. He then spent several years as head of the Japanese Military Academy before receiving his appointment on Okinawa. On taking up his post on Okinawa, Ushijima immediately set about preparing the island's defense and improving his troops' morale. His calm manner, integrity, and quiet confidence earned him the admiration of his subordinates. Second in command of the 32nd Army was Major General Isamu Cho. A hard-headed and aggressive officer, in the 1930s, Cho had been associated with extremist officers who advocated setting up a military dictatorship in the name of the emperor. Although arrested, he was soon released and his career prospered. As an officer in the Kwantung Army in Korea, Cho had been intimately involved in provoking war with China in the 1930s. He reportedly took a leading role in organizing the mass killing of over 250,000 Chinese civilians at Nanking in 1938. During the war, he held a number of staff appointments in China, Burma, and Malaya. He came to Okinawa from the Military Affairs Bureau of the War Department. One of the brightest staff officers produced by the Imperial Japanese Army was 42-year-old Colonel Hiromichi Yahara. In the 1930s, he spent 2 years as an exchange officer in America, giving him a unique insight into the nature and strength of his future enemy. His modest but fiercely intellectual nature often brought him into conflict with more senior officers who wanted obedience, not questions, from their subordinates. Admiral Suemu Toyoda led the Imperial Japanese Navy to a series of overwhelming defeats at the Philippine Sea and off the Leyte Gulf. By 1945, he seemed to lose confidence in his decision-making. In a divided navy, opinions on Toyoda's abilities varied greatly. Some considered him a brilliant man, broken by insurmountable problems. His detractors thought him lacking in intelligence and ability. At Okinawa, however, he fatefully ordered the battleship Yamato to attack US shipping off the island in the knowledge that she was doomed. Even more reprehensible was the fact that in order to carry out the attack, 1 month's oil supply had to be requisitioned from the merchant navy at a time when Japan's people were desperate for imported food. Such callous decisions were spurred not by military realism, but Toyoda's belief that it would dishonor the Imperial Navy if a ship bearing Japan's ancient spiritual name was surrendered to the enemy. Toyoda's decision typifies the conceit of a navy that placed its own warped idea of honor above the needs of the people it was supposed to serve. The plan for Operation Iceberg was drawn up between September 1944 and February 1945. It was the most audacious and complex amphibious operation to be undertaken by US forces in the Pacific War. The basic aim was to seize Okinawa in order to develop bases there to support the future invasion of Japan. Iceberg's objectives were only achievable by accumulating vast numbers of men and resources. It required the complex cooperation of naval and amphibious forces from Nimitz's command, as well as close coordination with Army and Air Force units in neighboring theaters. Iceberg was to be the ultimate test of lessons learned by American forces during their advance across the Pacific. The The invasion was directly controlled by Vice Admiral Spruance's Central Pacific Task Force. Spruance's plan of attack was initially conceived in 4 phases. Phase 1 was to be conducted by Vice Admiral Mitch's fast carriers of Task Force 58 and B-29 Superfortress heavy bombers of General LeMay's 21st Bomber Command. Attacks by these forces were intended to isolate Okinawa by neutralizing Japanese air power in the Ryukyu, Japanese home islands, and Formosa. Once this was completed, Mitch's fast carriers were to take station east of Okinawa and provide support to the other phases of Iceberg. Mitch was also responsible for eliminating any enemy surface threat. Joining American naval forces for the first time would be the British Pacific Fleet. Commanded by Vice Admiral Sir Bernard Rawlings, the British carriers of Task Force 57 were assigned to protect the left flank of the invasion by mounting strikes against Japanese air assets in the Sakishima Islands and Formosa. In Phase 2, Vice Admiral Turner's Joint Expeditionary Force was to support landings by the 24th Army and 3rd Amphibious Corps of Lieutenant General Simon Buckner's 10th Army. These forces were initially assigned to secure the Keizeshima and Kirama Group Islands west of Okinawa. The main landings would then take place on the Hagushi beaches along the center of Okinawa's west coast. The second phase would end with the securing of the southern part of the island. In Phase 3, the remainder of the island would be occupied, along with the Eshima, in and off the northwest coast. Iceberg was larger than any other operation of the Pacific War. 183,000 troops and 747,000 tons of supplies were loaded into over 430 assault vessels and landing ships at 11 different ports, from Seattle on the west coast of the United States to Leyte in the Philippines. A further 115,000 service troops would land once Okinawa was secured to begin developing port and base facilities and airfields. Including naval forces, by the end of the campaign, 548,000 personnel participated in the campaign. They were supported by 318 combat vessels and 1,139 auxiliary ships. During the campaign, 60 carriers were available to provide air cover. Of these, 26 were fleet and light, the remainder escort carriers. 18 battleships and over 200 destroyers were used. During operations between March and June 1945, Spruance's Fifth Fleet consumed more fuel than Japan imported in 1944. From September 1943, the Ryukyu Islands assumed increasing importance in Japanese plans, although little was immediately done to develop their defenses. When the loss of the Marianas in June 1944 made a thrust against the Ryukyus a real possibility, reinforcements for Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima's 32nd Army began pouring in to defend these islands. Despite these initial measures, by January 1945, the Army and Navy were split over whether the decisive battle should be waged on Okinawa or the Japanese home islands. The Navy hoped to secure a victory off Japan and resolved to commit the bulk of its air power at Okinawa. In contrast, the Army was convinced that Japan was the best place to defeat the Americans. Accordingly, troops were steadily withdrawn from Okinawa, and promised reinforcements never materialized. This inter-service quarrel gradually made it clear to Ushijima that his forces were going to be sacrificed. He abandoned his existing plans to defeat an American invasion at the shoreline. The new plan was based upon sound arguments from Colonel Hiromichi Yahara. Aware of the overwhelming firepower available to the Americans, Yahara decided to concentrate 32nd Army's main strength in the south around the ancient capital of Shuri. The 62nd Infantry Division would defend 3 lines in this area, while the 24th Infantry Division covered potential landing sites around Minato on the southeast coast. Each division would be used to reinforce the other, depending on the direction of the main US attack. Only elements of the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade and a few service troops were deployed in the center and north of Okinawa. These were ordered to harass and delay the Americans as best they could. Yahara intended to fight a long and bloody battle of attrition. Okinawa was riddled by steep escarpments and ravines. East-west limestone plateau and ridges formed natural and mutually supporting lines of defense. Natural caves and burial tombs were easily converted into strong underground positions, largely invulnerable to enemy air and artillery fire. To man these defenses, 32nd Army had 65,000 regular troops and 8,800 naval personnel. 20,000 residents had formed a militia. At Okinawa, America would be battered by the greatest concentration of artillery encountered by US forces in the Pacific War. By doggedly holding their fortified positions, the defenders of Okinawa would have to be blasted out position by position at a heavy cost in American lives. As the forces on Okinawa prepared to sacrifice themselves, Imperial General Headquarters prepared to implement its Tenichigo plan. This involved the concentration of Army and Navy aircraft on Formosa, Kyushu, and around Tokyo. With the Navy providing the bulk of these forces, Army air units were placed under direct control of the commander of the combined fleet, Admiral Toyoda. The dilemma confronting Toyoda was how to use these forces in the face of American quantitative and qualitative superiority. Although the battle for Okinawa was ultimately decided on land, the most original tactical and technological developments were in the air and at sea. By 1945, the quality of Japanese pilots had slumped. The Imperial Navy was all but irrelevant as a fighting force. As a result, the Japanese High Command decided on the widespread adoption of new forms of the kamikaze tactic. Suicide attacks were not new. Throughout the war, Japanese pilots had demonstrated their willingness to crash into Allied vessels. However, during the fighting off the Philippines in 1944, what had once been a random act of self-sacrifice was converted into a formal and lethal method of attack by the Imperial Navy. The reason for this was simple. The only way that the Japanese could replace their huge aircrew losses was to cut back training programs. By late 1944, Japanese pilots had an average of only 2 or 3 months training. Rival US Navy pilots had 2 years training, and often the chance to acquire combat experience in minor actions. The resulting quality gap meant that Japanese air formations were regularly annihilated in combat. To overcome the lack of training and Allied air defenses during the Battle for Leyte in 1944, Vice Admiral Onishi instructed his pilots to deliberately ram their planes into Allied warships. As Japan's situation deteriorated, by 1945, greater reliance was placed upon the use of what were now termed Special Attack Corps, or Toko, to compensate for Japanese inferiority. Special attack units comprised 3 kamikazes, supported by an observer aircraft and a fighter. This tactical formation was intended to maximize success by delivering a coordinated attack. The kamikazes were armed with conventional bombs or torpedoes to increase their destructive power. To avoid errors in the attack, the bombs were already fused. As the weight of the payloads often made the aircraft less maneuverable and consequently more vulnerable to Allied fighter planes, sophisticated tactics were replaced by a fast sprint towards the target. During the approach to the target, special attack groups learned to confuse American radar operators by following returning US air groups closely enough to mingle with their radar echoes. They sent out false signals to mimic the transmitters on US aircraft that identified them as friends to shipborne radar. To further baffle enemy radar, the kamikazes approached erratically, constantly changing altitude in the hope of breaking contact. In the final assault, a number of planes would mass against a single ship, attacking from several directions in order to overwhelm its anti-aircraft defenses. Uniquely in the Okinawa campaign, Imperial General Headquarters decided to launch a series of special attack missions called Kikusui. These consisted of up to several hundred aircraft, supported by conventional attack aircraft. After seeing off any Allied fighters, the massed planes of the Kikusui would swoop on exposed Allied vessels, overwhelming them by sheer weight of numbers and will. To achieve maximum effect in these attacks, the Japanese developed a series of specialized weapons and deployed their most advanced warship. The Imperial Navy began to design a specialized aircraft to carry out kamikaze attacks, instead of relying on less devastating and more vulnerable conventional aircraft. The most radical design was that of Ensign Mitsuo Ota for a rocket-propelled attack plane. The result was the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, meaning cherry blossom. Built partly of wood, the Oka was carried underneath a G4M Betty medium bomber and released about 50 miles from the target. The pilot then held a fast glide at about 290 miles an hour. When the target was in sight, a rocket was ignited while the aircraft was pushed over into a steep dive for the last 30 seconds. Its 800-kilogram warhead would smash into the victim at over 400 miles per hour, causing massive damage. The critical weakness of the Oka was the slow and cumbersome parent aircraft needed to deliver it. On numerous occasions in the Battle for Okinawa, US fighters intercepted the Okas during their approach, shredding them out of the skies. US pilots mockingly dubbed the plane Baka, meaning fool. By 1945, Allied action had reduced the Japanese submarine fleet to a shadow of its former self. To stem the tide of American naval power, the Navy diverted research and materials into more economical submersible weapons. The Kai-10, or Divine Fate, was developed by Lieutenants Hirohisi Kuroki and Sakio Nishina. It was based upon the highly effective Long Lance Type 93 oxygen-propelled shipborne torpedo. The pilot occupied a tiny cockpit equipped with a small periscope on top of the torpedo. Powered by a hydrogen peroxide engine, the Kai-10 had an attack speed of 40 knots, delivering a 1.5-ton warhead. The short range of the weapon meant it had to be delivered strapped to the deck of a conventional seagoing submarine. This made launching the Kai-10 a clumsy and risky affair. Having reached the target area, the parent submarine had to surface to enable the Kai-10 pilots to board their boats. At a word from the pilots, the parent boat submerged, casting off the shackles holding the 4 kaiten. Throughout this procedure, the parent submarine was exposed to detection and attack from radar-equipped enemy air and surface units. The Shinyo, known as Ocean Shaker, was a suicide attack motorboat. Made of plywood, the boats were about 18 feet long and powered by a 6-cylinder Chevrolet car engine that gave them a top speed of about 20 knots. In one version, 2 depth charges, each weighing 264 pounds, were carried on a rack behind the pilot. The tactic was for 3 boats to attack simultaneously, each seeking a vital spot alongside the enemy vessel before releasing their charges astern. A 5-second delay on the fuse was intended to give the vessel time to withdraw. In reality, however, the fragile boats stood little chance of surviving the blast waves. Consequently, pilots were promoted 2 grades and received preferential treatment. On completion of the attack, they received promotion to second lieutenant. Most of these promotions were posthumous. Another variant of the Shinyo was fitted with bow charges. This was a dedicated suicide weapon designed to be rammed at high speed into the side of an enemy vessel. There was a facility for locking the wheel during the final approach in case the pilot's courage failed at the last moment. Over 350 Shinyo boats were hidden around Okinawa. During the interwar years, the Japanese Navy tried to match the US Navy's growing strength. Battleships Yamato and Musashi. Their general design was approved in July 1936, and at 69,000 tons, they were nearly twice the size of any other battleship afloat. Despite their bulk, they were capable of an impressive 27 knots, and at the start of the war, their turning abilities were superior to any other capital ship. At the heart of their design were 9 18.1-inch guns, the most powerful guns ever placed aboard a battleship. The guns were housed in 3 turrets, each heavier than a destroyer. Each shell weighed 1.5 tons, and the designated rate of fire was over 1.5 rounds per minute. The Yamato class were also designed to absorb merciless punishment. Their armor was capable of withstanding hits from the most powerful torpedoes and from shells fired 20,000 meters away. Built under the strictest secrecy, the Yamato and Musashi entered service in 1941 and 42 respectively. Security surrounding the 2 ships was so effective that until the end of the war, Allied intelligence on their capabilities was minimal. Generally held in reserve, Yamato and Musashi saw relatively little action until the late stages of the war. Even then, they never engaged in the ship-to-ship gun duel they'd been designed to fight, as the carrier superseded the battleship as the standard of naval power. Central to the American fleet's combat power were aircraft carriers. The heavy and light carriers made up the main battle forces of Vice Admiral Mitch's Task Force 58, often called the Fast Carrier Group because of the high speed of its capital ships. The mainstay of the Fast Carrier Group were the heavy or fleet carriers of the Essex class. Big and fast, these ships displaced over 27,000 tons and were capable of a maximum speed just in excess of 32 knots. The size and armament of the Essex carriers enabled them to withstand and inflict heavy punishment. By late 1944, kamikaze attacks prompted the US Navy to look at the defenses of its carriers. There was only one way to stop a kamikaze: total disintegration, and there were only 20 seconds to do so once it came within range of the ship's guns. The Americans strengthened the Essex's anti-aircraft defences by adding more guns to create a literal wall of fire around the ship. Extra 40mm guns were fitted. They also counted 12 lethal 5-inch guns and over 60 smaller 20mm weapons amongst their armament. Great use was made of VT, or proximity fuses, installed in anti-aircraft shells. Before VT fuses were introduced, anti-aircraft fire required the shell to be delivered near the target, and its detonation by a timer fuse set to the right distance. The VT fuse made destroying enemy aircraft easier by deciding the distance from the target via electrical waves reflected off the surface of the target. The combination of radar, inexperienced Japanese aircrew, and their aircraft's lack of armour transformed the VT fuse into a lethal weapon against Japanese air attacks. Okinawa was the first time that British carrier forces had operated in the Western Pacific. The 4 fleet carriers of the British task force had several features that made them less vulnerable to serious damage from aerial attack than their American cousins. Designed to operate in the narrow seas of Europe in range of land-based aircraft, British carriers were shaped by passive defence. Steel decks and armoured hangars gave their carriers greater strength, especially when under kamikaze attack. In contrast, the wooden decks of the American carriers were easily penetrated by kamikazes that exploded amongst the aircraft and combustible materials on the hangar deck below. Despite greater resilience to direct hits, British carriers inflicted far less damage than their American counterparts. Armoured hangars reduced the number of aircraft that could be carried. This made it difficult to deploy strong fighter cover over the British fleet. In offensive operations, lack of numbers meant that enemy ground defences could not be saturated. Consequently, during the Okinawa campaign, the British suffered proportionately higher rates of loss than American air groups. Central to improving the carrier's defences and protecting invasion shipping against kamikaze attacks was the quality of the fighter aircraft. The most impressive carrier-borne aircraft available during the Okinawa campaign was the Vought F-6F Corsair. Generally recognised as the finest fighter of the Second World War, development of the Corsair began as early as 1938. The first production model didn't make its initial flight until the 25th of June 1942. In order to enable the Combat Air Patrol, or CAP, to intercept kamikazes, a greater speed and rate of climb than the Hellcat was needed. With a top speed of 440 miles an hour, the Corsair was around 60 miles an hour faster than its rival. It also outclimbed the Hellcat by 800 feet per second. These superior characteristics were enhanced by a standard armament of 6 half-inch machine guns, and the Corsair's ability to double as a ground attack aircraft, carrying 2 1,000-pound bombs or 8 5-inch rockets. By mid-1943, with increasing production of fleet and light carriers, the number of available task groups rose dramatically. To coordinate these groups in late 1943, Admiral Nimitz formed the Fast Carrier Force. The Fast Carrier Force had a complement of just under 1,000 aircraft and comprised 4 task groups operating in close proximity for better coordination. Allowing for ships away in dock, each group consisted of 2 fleet and 2 light carriers, with a battleship or heavy cruiser and several destroyers in support. Its strength was the high speed of its heavy ships. The battleships could keep station at 27 knots, while the carriers could maintain 30 knots for several hours. Supporting the fast carrier force was an impressive logistic train. A fleet oiler and transport carrier group of 24 oilers provided fuel and replacement aircraft. Additional support came from the fleet train that for the Okinawa campaign consisted of 206 support ships. These included repair ships, floating dry docks, hospital ships, salvage vessels, ammunition, victualling and store ships. Two impressive features of operations in 1945 were first the ability to re-ammunition heavy ships at sea. Second, the rotation of air crews between sea operations and rest ashore. During the Okinawa campaign, these factors enabled the fast carrier force to maintain a high level of combat effectiveness over 92 days of action without it ever having to return to port. No fleet in history has ever sustained combat operations for so long at such intensity, so far from its home shore. The ability of the fast carriers to provide timely and effective protection relied upon advance warning of enemy aircraft. This task was given to the destroyer radar pickets and fighter direction ships. 15 radar pickets were deployed to cover all points of the compass, 50 to 70 miles from the main fleet anchorage of western Okinawa. Picket ships were concentrated in the north and northwest, areas considered the most likely approaches for Japanese attacks. 6 headquarters ships and 19 fighter direction ships were responsible for processing reports from the radar pickets and sending appropriate numbers of fighter aircraft to meet the threats. The whole line of picket ships controlled 8 to 16 fighter aircraft that could be rapidly reinforced by more aircraft on the fast and escort carrier groups. Once the landings were successfully underway, it was planned to install 2 radar stations ashore to relieve the exposed pickets. Land-based fighter aircraft would also be available to support the combat air patrol. There was some difference of opinion amongst senior naval officers about the role of radar pickets. Vice Admiral Turner stressed that their primary duty was to report air raids, leaving destruction of enemy aircraft to the cap and anti-aircraft fire. Turner's replacement in mid-May, Vice Admiral Hill, considered reporting secondary to the destruction of enemy aircraft and breaking up their formations. Despite this confusion, the radar pickets played a vital role in protecting the invasion fleet massed off Okinawa. Unfortunately, their exposed positions and lack of defensive firepower against multiple attacks meant that they suffered heavy losses. 5 were sunk and 16 were damaged. On the morning of the 14th of March 1945, the fleet carrier Bunker Hill manoeuvred its great bulk through the narrow exit channel from the Ulithi Atoll, some 1,100 miles southeast of Okinawa. Sat on the flag bridge, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher watched as the vast armada of the fast carrier force sorted in a single column. Emerging into the deep Pacific Ocean, the force deployed into a cruising formation of 4 groups. Task Force 58 totaled 10 fleet and 6 light carriers, supported by 8 fast battleships and 80 other combat vessels bristling with anti-aircraft guns to defend their more fragile cousins. Mitcher's forces were to prepare the way for the invasion fleet, now massing from across the Pacific, by neutralizing enemy air power in southern Japan. After replenishing at sea on the 16th, the task groups began a high-speed run in towards Kyushu. At first light on the 18th of March, just 90 miles from the Japanese coast, Mitscher signaled his carriers to turn into the wind and commence launching their powerful air groups. The first strike waves commenced attacks against 45 airfields around 5:40 a.m., with devastating results. Bombing and strafing attacks reduced buildings to ash and rubble, cratered runways, and destroyed aircraft. During these operations, the US carrier groups came under attack from the 5th Air Fleet on Kyushu. Vice Admiral Ugaki had initially been ordered to disperse his aircraft and avoid attacking the Americans in order to conserve his strength for the coming Battle of Okinawa. Alerted that Task Force 58 had sorted from Ulithi, he knew it would be impossible to preserve his forces against 4 enemy task groups. Locating the Americans late on the 17th, the following day Ugaki launched a dawn attack against Rear Admiral Radford's task group. Despite intensive defensive fire and fighter cover, Ugaki's men pressed home their attacks against the carriers. The Enterprise had a lucky escape when a bomb failed to explode. Intrepid was damaged by a near miss that started fires, killing 2 and wounding 43 of her crew. Yorktown took a bomb through her deck. The resulting explosion blew 2 holes through her hull. The deadly duel continued the following day as Task Force 58's aircraft struck further north at Japanese merchant and warships at Kure and Kobe. Ugaki counterattacked again, this time concentrating against Rear Admiral Davidson's carriers. Luck was with the Japanese pilots that day. A lone aircraft managed to slip through American defenses, scoring a direct hit on the Wasp, causing internal fires on 5 decks. However, expert American firefighting and damage control quickly brought the situation under control, and within an hour, Wasp was recovering aircraft. Casualties were high, with over 100 dead and 269 wounded. The heaviest damage and loss of life was suffered by Davidson's flagship, the Franklin. In the process of launching her second wave of aircraft, a lone Japanese plane flew low right down the flight deck, dropping 2 bombs. Explosions erupted on the hangar and flight decks. Bombs and rockets aboard the American aircraft went off, causing further damage. With the Franklin in flames and listing heavily, Davison transferred to the cruiser Santa Fe, who came alongside to take off survivors and turn her hoses on the Franklin's roaring fires. After 3 hours, the Franklin was brought under tow by the cruiser Pittsburgh. In an incredible feat, by the morning of the 20th, the Franklin was able to make way under her own power at 15 knots. Casualties were extreme. Over a third of her crew were killed or wounded. Eventually, the most heavily damaged aircraft carrier in the world sailed 12,000 miles to the Brooklyn Naval Yard, New York. But before the Franklin was safe, she had to get out of reach of the enemy's aircraft. Determined to bring the damaged carrier home, Vice Admiral Mitscher ordered his forces to retire slowly and provide cover. On the afternoon of the 20th of March, Ukagi, sensing the chance to finish off the crippled American ship, attacked again. US fighter sweeps over Japanese airfields prevented any major attacks being launched, and consequently only the destroyer Halsey Powell was hit. Enterprise again escaped 2 near misses, only to receive damage from US guns when other ships trying to knock down an enemy plane aimed too low and hit her. Both sides disputed the degree of damage inflicted by Task Force 58's attacks. US pilots claimed to have destroyed 528 aircraft. The Japanese admitted to 163 lost. What is clear is that US carrier attacks against airfields on Kyushu, followed a week later by intensive bombardment of the same targets by B-29 heavy bombers, prevented the Japanese mounting any effective air raids against the invasion forces off Okinawa until the 6th of April. It would be too late to strike before or during the preliminary and main landings. On the 24th of March, the first ships of the invasion fleet arrived. These were the minesweepers, designated to sweep the approaches to Okinawa and the surrounding islands. Their slogan of "No sweep, no invasion" highlights their importance to the campaign, during which they swept over 3,000 square miles of sea to ensure the safety of invasion shipping. Although the Japanese had not carried out extensive mining operations, there proved enough devices to make trouble. Once swept channels were open on the 24th of March, Micha detached 6 fast battleships to bombard the beaches around Minatoga on Okinawa as part of the plan to deceive the Japanese about the exact location of the invasion. The following day, Micha's battleships were reinforced by the appearance of Admiral Durgin's 18 escort carriers. A force of light cruisers and destroyers started softening up the Kerama Islands to the west of Okinawa in preparation for the arrival of the 77th Division. Surface bombardment of intended landing sites began in earnest on the 26th of March, with the arrival of the main body of the Gunfire and Covering Force, Task Force 54. Steaming in 4 close columns through a 10-mile swept channel between the Keramas and Okinawa, Task Force 54 was an impressive sight. From the 26th of March to the main landings on the 1st of April, Task Force 54 pounded known and suspected Japanese positions. In total, 5,162 tons of ammunition were expended, over 27,000 rounds greater than 5 inches in caliber. Most impressive to observers were the flames and rubble thrown up by the 14 and 16-inch guns of 10 old battleships. 5 of these battle wagons had been sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor in 1941. It was perhaps fitting that they took part in the US Navy's final campaign of the war. At 8:01 a.m. on the 26th of March, the ground campaign erupted when 4 battalions of the 77th Division began landing on the Kerama Islands. These small land masses were unsuitable for airfields and could not support large concentrations of troops. But the roadsteads between the islands offered anchorages for fleet supply and repair vessels, minesweepers and their tenders, landing craft and boat pools. A base for flying boats responsible for anti-submarine patrols could also be established. Once secured, the Keramas would become a forward fleet base and provide a springboard for securing the tiny islands of Keizeshima, 6 to 8 miles from the southern coast of Okinawa. Not expecting an attack against the Keramas, the Japanese defences were weak and poorly manned. Resistance on Garuma consisted only of long-range sniper fire, whilst Okaji was secured without a fight. By early afternoon, Yakabi was secured. Over the next 2 days, Japanese troops had to be routed out of hills and caves on the Aka and Zamami Islands. The largest island, Tokoshiki, was quickly secured, except for the continued resistance of the garrison in the hills. By the 29th of March, all the islands were secured, followed by the Keizeshima 2 days later. Casualties were surprisingly low, with 31 killed and 84 wounded. Over 121 Japanese had been taken prisoner, offering hope to US commanders that Okinawa may be as easy to subdue. At dawn on Easter Sunday, the 1st of April, over 1,300 American ships packed the waters around Okinawa. Just after 4 a.m., thousands of Marines and soldiers began climbing down scrambling nets into landing craft alongside their transports. Specialized tank landing ships spread their yawning bow doors and launched a wave of amphibious M4A4 Sherman tanks. Behind them, 5 to 7 waves of Amtraks formed up 4,000 yards from the beaches. These armored troop carriers were designed to take the infantry safely to the shore and then over the exposed beaches. As hundreds of assault craft moved into position, warships and other fire support craft continued to saturate the beaches with the heaviest pre-invasion bombardment of the war. Over 44,000 shells of between 5 and 16 inches in caliber were fired to prepare the way for the landing forces. At 8 a.m., command ships dipped their signal pennants, and along an 8-mile front, the waves of assault craft carrying men of the 1st and 6th Marine and 7th and 96th Army Divisions began the final approach to Okinawa. Ahead of them, smaller artillery and rocket-armed monitors raced forwards to deliver point-blank salvos in the final moments before landing. At 8:42 a.m., the first wave hit the Hagushi beaches. Throughout the day, this choreographed landing procedure continued as successive waves formed on the departure line and then made for the shore. In the first hour, 16,000 troops were landed. By nightfall, 60,000 troops, with stores, vehicles and artillery, were secured in a large bridgehead. The opening day of Operation Iceberg had surpassed all expectations. Airfields at Yontan and Kadena were secured at a cost of relatively few casualties. The night, however, was eerily quiet. US commanders were puzzled. Why hadn't the anticipated Japanese retaliation started? Where was the enemy? Lieutenant General Ushijima and most of the 32nd Army were, as planned, dug in far to the south. During the 1st of April, Ushijima and his staff had observed the US operations from the high ground near Shuri. Unable to obtain accurate intelligence about the location of the main Japanese positions, the seasoned troops of the 3rd Amphibious and 24th Army Corps continued to push quickly inland against sporadic enemy resistance. With the eastern coast reached by the 3rd of April, the center of Okinawa was under US control. Lieutenant General Buckner decided to accelerate his plans. Originally, 3rd Amphibious Corps' strike north was scheduled for Phase 3 of the operation. These forces were ordered to proceed and take the Motobu Peninsula simultaneously with 24th Army Corps' thrust south. Over the next 2 weeks, the Marines of Major General Roy Geiger's 3rd Amphibious Corps made rapid progress in clearing northern Okinawa. Apart from crushing 2 small pockets of Japanese troops, the only obstacle facing the Marines was the rugged terrain. As they pushed forwards, service and engineer troops repaired roads and built bridges to support the speed of operations. On the 7th of April, the only substantial Japanese forces facing Geiger's Marines had been sealed into the Motobu Peninsula. 6 days later, tank infantry teams of the 6th Marine Division reached the northern tip of the island. 3rd Amphibious Corps began preparations to stamp out the isolated Japanese. Being so ahead of schedule, the Marines had reason to be confident of a swift end to the campaign. Hopes of a swift land victory were extinguished as the 7th and 96th Divisions of 24th Army Corps reached the outer positions of Ushijima's Shuri defense barrier. Near Arakuchi was a 450-foot ridge, nicknamed the Pinnacle because of a 30-foot coral spike on its summit. On the 5th of April, 7th Division tried to take this position, but was driven back. The Japanese defences on this ridge were a taster of what lay in store along the main defensive line further south. The Pinnacle was defended by a company of 120 Japanese of the 14th Independent Battalion, led by 1st Lieutenant Seiji Tanagawa. The ridge was honeycombed with trenches, pits and underground passages, with all the main approaches mined and covered with barbed wire. The base of the hill was defended by 10 light and heavy machine guns, supported by 7 50mm mortars. From these positions, the Japanese could shelter from the initial enemy artillery barrage. When the barrage lifted, the defenders could emerge unscathed to concentrate fire on US infantry struggling over the wire and mines. On the 6th of April, fresh attempts were made to overrun Tanagawa's position. Under cover of a short preparatory artillery barrage, B Company started to make swift progress. But as the US troops neared the top, they came under intense small arms fire from Japanese troops who'd rushed from the caves they'd taken cover in during the barrage. B Company desperately held on to its gains for a quarter of an hour before being forced to retire. When the attack was renewed an hour later, the Japanese raced from their caves, some actually running through the artillery fire to push the Americans back again. Soon afterwards, Tanagawa, directing the battle from the pinnacle, was ready for B Company's third attack, seen massing below. So concerned was Tanagawa in dealing with the threat from his front that he completely missed C Company's attack from the flank until it was too late. The US troops swarmed over the ridge, systematically wiping the enemy out with grenades and flamethrowers. The fighting at the pinnacle established a pattern in which the Japanese proved extremely effective at dealing with frontal attacks, but very poor at responding to flanking movements. As the fight for the pinnacle raged on, further west the 96th Division had been heavily engaged around the feature dubbed Cactus Ridge. This position caused considerable problems because of its anti-tank moat and mined approaches that again restricted the direction of the US attack. Consequently, the American officers assigned to take the ridge decided that a stand-up frontal charge was the only option. Over the next 24 hours, several such American banzai charges placed the ridge in their hands. The battle for Okinawa was to see a combination of the subtle tactics at the pinnacle and the direct assault used at Cactus Ridge. Over the next few days, Hodges' divisions continued their increasingly slow move south against the outer works of 32nd Army's main line around Shuri. During fighting for the Tomb and Triangulation Hills, the 7th Division ran into crippling Japanese artillery fire. The barrage devastated the American tactic of using infantry tank teams by driving the infantry back and disabling the tanks, whose trapped crews were then bayoneted. By the 8th of April, a series of bloody assaults secured the Japanese positions. Soon afterwards, an attempt to outflank the next Japanese positions was repulsed by undetected enemy positions to the rear. The discovery of these supporting positions in depth convinced 7th Division's commanders that they had reached the main enemy defense line. A similar conclusion was drawn by the 96th Division, who had just received a costly repulse at the foot of the formidable defenses around the Kazaku Ridge. After a week of confusion and suspicion, Lieutenant General Buckner finally located the enemy. But with so many lives already lost, this discovery offered little comfort. While the US 10th Army probed towards the main Japanese positions on Okinawa, the vast armada of ships continued to unload troops and supplies. Although Imperial General Headquarters had authorized its Operation Tengo defense plan for Okinawa on the 25th of March, the destruction caused by US airstrikes against Kyushu prevented any air raids until the 6th of April. That day, Admiral Toyoda launched the first Kikusui attack of over 900 aircraft, 355 of them kamikazes. The first US vessels to suffer were the exposed radar pickets. By nightfall, 3 had been lost. 8 destroyers were also damaged, and 2 ammunition ships and a transport also sunk. The following day, Toyoda threw in another massive attack. A kamikaze penetrated the defense screen off Hagushi beaches, crashing into the battleship Maryland, inflicting over 50 casualties. A group of 20 aircraft approaching the transport area failed to score any successes, losing 12 to fighter and anti-aircraft fire. Once again, the radar pickets suffered at the hands of overwhelming enemy numbers. The destroyer escort USS Western was hit by a kamikaze that thundered out of the clouds while her guns were firing on 3 sides. Fires ripped through her decks and power was lost, but managing the damage brought the situation under control and she was able to make her way to Kerama. Taking advantage of the absence of the strike groups from the carriers of Task Force 58, Toyota mounted a series of powerful attacks against the carriers. On Okinawa, as Buckner prepared for a major attack on the main Japanese defences in the south, final plans to secure the north of the island were made. These involved simultaneous attacks against the Motobu Peninsula and the nearby island of Iishima. The centre of Japanese resistance on the Motobu Peninsula was the Yaitake Hill Mass, which was defended by Colonel Udo and 2,000 troops. Initially, the 6th Marine Division's operations were hampered by low cloud cover and dense vegetation, preventing aerial reconnaissance from locating Udo's main position. Snipers added to the confusion, drawing the Marines in the wrong direction. In the end, the chance capture of an enemy map on the 13th of April finally revealed Udo's position, and the Marines immediately positioned 4 battalions around Yaitake for an assault. On the 16th of April, as the 2 battalions pressured the Japanese from the east, 2 battalions of the 4th Marine Regiment moved to seize the crest from the north, aided by a thrust by the 1st Battalion, 4th Marine Regiment from the south. In the face of heavy mortar and small arms fire, this concentric assault managed to secure the crest of the position in a series of charges. But this still left the Marines with the task of securing the rest of Udo's positions in the area. A determined and well-planned attack on the 17th of April routed the remaining Japanese troops from the Yaitake position. Lieutenant Colonel John Moreau's 1st Battalion, 29th Marine Regiment carried out a skillful deception plan that distracted the enemy from his main force scaling the almost sheer cliffs on the south side of the main peak. By evening, 2 companies held the summit. At the same time, the 4th Marines moved rapidly north through enemy positions, killing 700 Japanese. Counter-guerrilla operations against remaining small pockets of Japanese continued well into May, when the 6th Marine Division was shifted south to the main battle. As the Marines cleared the main land, the 77th Division disembarked to secure Iishima. The island was an ideal location for an early warning radar, and its 3 airfields would provide much-needed air support for operations ashore and at sea. Assuming the best beaches would be heavily defended, the division landed under naval gunfire at a less favourable landing site, catching the Japanese by surprise. But the advantage was short-lived. The main Japanese defences were located around the town of Ie and the ridges approaching the steep slopes of Mount Igusugu. The main barrier to an advance against the defences on Mount Igusugu was a height soon dubbed Bloody Ridge by the Americans. At the summit of Bloody Ridge was a concrete building which the 77th Division called Government Hill House. Defending these positions were 2,000 troops and civilians, including women carrying wooden spears. Despite the unopposed landings of the 16th of April, over the next 2 days the Americans failed to secure Bloody Ridge in the face of powerful Japanese counterattacks. Major General Andrew Bruce, commanding 77th Division, was forced to review his plans and prepare a series of fresh and ultimately successful attacks. The 305th and 307th Regiments renewed a slow advance through the town and west onto Bloody Ridge. The main attack by the 306th Regimental Combat Team fell from the north. Government House was secured by the 307th Regiment and then held in the face of ferocious enemy counterattacks. G Company 2nd Battalion counted 280 Japanese bodies in front of its positions. With Government House and EA secured, the Americans moved swiftly against the last positions on Mount Eigasugu. The peak was finally captured just before 2 o'clock, when the American flag was raised. Many Japanese and civilians still remained in the caves, and on the 22nd of April they mounted a futile attack. At the end, over 4,700 Japanese, including 1,500 civilians, had been killed. US losses totaled 172 dead and over 900 wounded. The cost was worth it for possession of airfields that by the end of the month provided vital cover to shipping off the Haguchi and recently secured Nakagosuku beaches. Having spent several days bringing up fresh aircraft to replace the heavy losses from earlier attacks, Admiral Toyoda's forces struck again at Spruance's fleet clustered around Okinawa. 3 Kikusui attacks were mounted between the 11th and the 16th of April. Warned about the first of these attacks by a talkative Japanese prisoner, Micha cancelled plans for air support over Okinawa and readied Task Force 58 for imminent attack. The British Pacific Fleet moved to strike airfields on Formosa to lessen the threat from Spruance's left flank. The gunfire support group was reduced to the bare minimum for shore support, so that most of its vessels could cruise at sea in a tight formation for maximum defence. On the 11th of April, the Allies met the resolute attacks of 185 kamikazes and 45 torpedo bombers. In line with Japanese planning, 150 fighters were armed to sweep aside enemy cap for the attack aircraft. This proved a complete failure. North of Okinawa, US fighters outgunned their less experienced opponents in a series of fierce skirmishes that cost the Japanese nearly a quarter of their aircraft. This pattern of events was repeated the following day, and again on the 16th of April, with the radar pickets once more bearing the brunt of the attacks. One of these, the destroyer Laffey, might have been excused from thinking that it was the sole aim of the attacks on the 16th of April. In 80 minutes, she suffered 22 separate attacks. Hit by 4 bombs and 6 kamikazes, only brilliant ship handling, damage control, and the bravery of her gunners saved her. Over this 3-day aerial assault, 2 destroyers were sunk and 10 were damaged. 8 other vessels were hit, including the carriers Essex, Enterprise, Intrepid, and the battleship Tennessee. The next Kikusui raids were not mounted until the 28th and 29th of April, while the Japanese replenished their exhausted air units. Even so, every day throughout April, the US Navy and the British Pacific Fleet were attacked by up to 20 planes that exacted a small but steady toll. As the Marines secured northern Okinawa and Vice Admiral Spruance's 5th Fleet rode out the massed kamikaze attacks, 10th US Army maneuvered into position for a major assault against the first of Ushijima's defense lines in front of Shuri. The 7th and 96th Divisions spent the 14th to the 19th of April reconnoitering enemy positions and mounting limited attacks to secure jumping-off points for a major offensive. To ensure the maximum chance of success against what were clearly strong enemy positions, Lieutenant General Buckner landed the 27th Division to reinforce the assault scheduled for the 19th of April. Facing the Americans were a series of heavily fortified ridges running east-west across the 4-mile isthmus. On the American right, the 27th Division was faced by a river crossing followed by an advance over rice fields, all under observation from enemy positions on Kazaku Ridge. In the center, the 96th Division faced the modest but well-defended Tombstone, Nishibaru and Tanabaru features. On the far right, the 7th Division was opposed by Hill 178 and the town of Uuki. Behind the forward positions ran the 200-foot-high Urasue Mura escarpment, followed by rough ground up to the Japanese inner defense ring around Shuri and Lieutenant General Usijima's headquarters. Defending the Japanese positions were veteran troops of the 62nd Division. It would take over 5 days of heavy and often confused close-quarter fighting for Buckner's men to break what they named the Machinato line. The advance on the 19th of April was preceded by a tremendous artillery barrage. Buckner massed the greatest concentration of ground artillery in the Pacific War, assisted by warships and hundreds of aircraft, strafing, rocketing, bombing, and napalming enemy positions. The Japanese, hidden deep within their shelters, waited until the fire finished, and then rushed to their positions before the American assault infantry could overrun them. Once again, US troops were confronted by well-fortified and skillfully linked underground and reverse-slope positions, backed by a range of artillery. These were in turn reinforced with savage, often suicidal counterattacks. Very quickly, the 3-division attack collapsed into a series of individual battles. After conducting a skilled river crossing outflanking the Kazaku Ridge to the west, 27th Division was halted at the western end of the Urasue Mura Ridge. In the center, 96th Division struggled to gain a series of toeholds on the Nishibaru Ridge. To the east, the 7th Division made no progress. Over the next few days, some of the bitterest and most chaotic fighting centered around a salient on the Kazaku Ridge. With the flanks of the 27th and 96th Divisions threatened, Japanese positions had to be reduced. Moving methodically west to east, elements of the 27th Division had nearly cleared the ridge by the afternoon of the 20th of April. However, the desperate fighting on the Urasura Muru Ridge required forces to be diverted away from Kazaku. The aggressive Japanese defenders immediately rushed more troops and mortars back onto the ridge. With enemy troops in its rear and no reserves, 27th Division was in a dangerous position. Only by borrowing troops from other formations did it finally encircle Kazaku Ridge. On the 24th of April, Bradford Force, equipped with tanks, armored flamethrowers, and self-propelled artillery, attacked to wipe out the Japanese, only to find they had escaped from under their noses. The central position of the Nishibaru Ridge made 96 Division's advance difficult. Fire from flanking positions and massed artillery took a heavy toll amongst the advancing troops. The Japanese waged a ferocious defense, mounting local counterattacks at every opportunity to drive off the tenuous American gains. Tanks and armored flamethrowers were delayed by the need to build crossing points across a nearby gorge. Although these vehicles subjected the Nishibaru-Tanabaru escarpments to severe attack, the Japanese retained the reverse slope. Like the rest of the Machinato line, the Nishibaru position finally fell with relative ease on the 24th of April, as 32nd Japanese Army withdrew to the inner Shuri defense line. Usijima's reason for this decision was the realization that the Americans were on the verge of penetrating his outer defensive ring. Rather than allowing the Americans to seize the initiative and fight a fluid battle in the open, where their firepower would devastate Japanese forces, Ushijima decided to force them to fight another costly frontal battle against well-prepared defences. Despite swiftly following up 32nd Army's retirement, in the last days of April, the battered and exhausted 24th US Army Corps made little headway against the inner Shuri defense line. Facing the strongest Japanese defenses in the Pacific War, Lieutenant General Buckner decided to relieve the 27th and 96th Divisions by sending 3rd Amphibious Corps south. Buckner's actions sparked controversy. The senior Marine officer, Major General Roy Geiger, argued for using his forces in an outflanking operation with landings on the Machinato beaches. Once ashore, the Marines could collapse the exposed Japanese defences from the rear with relative ease. While there were strong arguments for the Marines' amphibious manoeuvre, planners of the Navy and of 10th Army had legitimate reservations. The troops of 24th Corps were close to collapse. This would have left only 2 divisions of 3rd Amphibious Corps for landings against the strongly defended beaches around Machinato. Above all, it was the naval commanders whose opinion counted most. They were adamant that in the face of heavy enemy air attacks, they could not spare the covering forces necessary to protect another transport group off Okinawa. In an ironic twist, unknown to the Americans, Ushijima had already moved the 24th Division from the Machinato sector to reinforce the battered 62nd Division before Shuri. By the start of May, Buckner's forces had completed their reorganization, with the 1st Marine and 77th Divisions moving into the line for another 3-division assault. By this time, US intelligence and front commanders had dismissed the possibility of large-scale Japanese counterattacks. On the 4th of May, their confidence was rudely shattered. Ever since the American landings, Imperial General Headquarters and more aggressive members of 32nd Army's staff had been advocating a more positive strategy. Major General Isamu Cho had been cajoling Isujima to mount an attack in early April. Colonel Yahara had opposed this shift from his original defensive concept. In the second week of May, Yahara again found himself strongly opposing Cho's demand for a major counteroffensive. To Yahara, any attack was futile and would only weaken 32nd Army's ability to prolong the battle. Under the cover of an artillery barrage, the assault regiments aimed to overrun the American artillery lines before the guns could respond. Amphibious raids were to attack the enemy from both flanks along the coast. Within hours, Yahara's predictions came true. All along the line, the offensive was an abject failure. US casualties were 649 dead. They counted over 6,237 Japanese bodies in front of their positions. The failure of Ushijima's counterattack did not prevent his troops from putting up a strong resistance against 24th Corps' subsequent attempts to secure jumping-off positions for a general assault on the inner Shuri line. These positions were finally secured at great cost. Buckner then reinforced his front with the 6th Marine Division and replaced 7th Division with the 96th. Orders were issued for an attack to envelop the Shuri line from east and west on the 11th of May. By now, US forces had adapted their tactics to the unique situation on Okinawa. General artillery barrages were rejected in favor of pinpoint fire against specific targets. VT proximity shells that burst directly over enemy trenches, showering them with lethal splinters, were also rushed to Okinawa. Infantry tank teams were extensively deployed where ground permitted. Most effective was the combination of small arms fire to neutralize enemy positions, so that infantry teams using flamethrowers and demolition charges could destroy the enemy in what Buckner termed blowtorch and corkscrew tactics. At first, the new American tactics achieved little, as 10th Army's attack broke down into a series of individual pitched battles. In the west, the two Marine divisions pushed slowly south towards the Asato River behind the Shuri Heights, from where the Japanese poured in constant, harassing fire. The hinge of the enemy positions in this sector was a complex of 3 hills. One of these, the Sugarloaf, proved the 6 Marines' toughest fight of the campaign. Despite tank, artillery and naval gunfire, the 6 Marines repeatedly failed to move over the crest against Japanese rear slope positions. It took 4 days of bitter fighting before Sugarloaf fell. It cost the Marines 2,662 casualties, and significantly a further 1,662 from combat fatigue. There was little respite for the Marines, who now had to batter their way through an equally strong defence complex around Horseshoe and Crescent Hills. The 1st Marine and 77th Divisions experienced equally tough opposition. Yet, in an attack on the Dakeshi Ridge, the Marines demonstrated that they were learning how to deal more effectively with Japanese tactics. On the 11th of May, a force of tanks was infiltrated behind the Dakeshi Ridge. There, they fired on Japanese troops running from their sheltered reverse slope positions to drive off the anticipated frontal attack after a preliminary artillery barrage. Marines were then able to move forwards and clear the remaining enemy positions. The 10th Army's decisive breakthrough during the 10-day battle before the Shuri line came unexpectedly in the east from 96th Division. The key to the Japanese defences in this sector was Conical Hill. The Corps and divisional commanders believed that only an attack from the west could succeed because of enemy positions on high ground dominating the eastern approaches to the position. In the end, Conical Hill was taken from the east. 2 platoon commanders chose to surprise the enemy by attacking through a stronger natural position, which they correctly guessed was only lightly defended. With Conical Hill taken, US forces were in a position to race into the Japanese rear and envelop Shuri. It seemed to all at 10th Army headquarters that the final destruction of 32nd Japanese Army was imminent. In mid-May, it became clear to Lieutenant General Usijima that American forces were close to achieving a breakthrough of his last defensive line. Ignoring the advice of Major General Cho and his staff for a last-ditch defense centered on Shuri, Usijima ordered a withdrawal to fresh positions in the south. When US 10th Army headquarters realized the Japanese were withdrawing rather than preparing for a last stand at Shuri, it ordered a general advance. Although the skeleton Japanese forces still covering Shuri were quickly overcome, lack of intelligence and the arrival of torrential rains prevented Buckner's forces from turning Usijima's retreat into a rout. Buckner's optimism that the Japanese would not be able to establish another strong defense line was quickly proved wrong. The few days' preparation afforded to the Japanese by the slow American pursuit enabled them to move into position on a massive escarpment comprising 2 formations, Yuzadake and Yeizudake. By this stage of the campaign, 32nd Army had only 14,000 troops, albeit with substantial fire support, to defend this formidable position with its 100-foot northern cliff face. Despite the futility of their position and the horrendous losses they had suffered, Ushijima's men were still ready to obey orders, to fight to the death. On the 6th of June, US forces began their final offensive of the Okinawa campaign. In the west, 1st Marine Division began a grueling 6-day battle on the Oroku Peninsula to eliminate the naval defense force, which had chosen to die on its own rather than with the army. In the center, fierce fighting pushed the US 96th Division to take a low ridge below the main Yuza-Yaezu escarpment, which was needed as a jumping-off point for the main assault. One company of the 381st Regiment suffered over 50% casualties trying to cross open ground from pre-registered enemy guns before being forced to retire. Over 5 days, the American division made only marginal gains. Fighting for the Yuza-Yaizu position and supporting position of Konishi Ridge to the west lasted until the 17th of June, when an exhausted Japanese defense finally collapsed under unremitting American pressure. Japanese resistance continued over the next week, but with the last major defensive positions in American hands, opposition usually consisted of small, isolated pockets holding out against well-organized combat units with tank support. Only 24th Japanese Division held out to the end as an organized force at Madeira. For the rest of the time, the battle became a manhunt, with Ushijima's disorganized forces fleeing before guns and flamethrowers, or surrendering in rising numbers. Okinawa was officially declared secure on the 22nd of June 1945. Neither of the two land commanders lived to witness the American victory. Ushijima took his own life by ritual suicide rather than endure the dishonor of surrender. The Americans paid a high price for success on Okinawa. Over 7,213 soldiers and Marines were killed, and another 31,000 wounded. At sea, the American and the small Allied force lost 36 ships, with 368 damaged. Japanese losses dwarfed those of the Americans. Around 110,000 men lost their lives, and 7,400 were taken prisoner. Over 7,800 planes were lost to just 773 American aircraft. Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, had also been ruthlessly crushed under American naval air power. As the bitter campaign for Okinawa was fought out from April to June 1945, Japanese and American planners prepared for the final battle on the Japanese home islands. Japan's plight in late 1945 was obvious to her leaders, but the question of unconditional surrender and the desire for assurances about the continuance of the emperor's rule prevented them from making peace. US leaders, shocked by the casualties and the hopeless, suicidal, seemingly fanatical nature of Japanese resistance on Okinawa, looked for another way of ending the war without resorting to a costly and protracted invasion. In defending the home islands, Imperial General Headquarters faced the dilemma that it could not adopt the passive tactics utilized on Okinawa. Japan could only be saved by defeating an American invasion at the water's edge, or through large counterattacks further inland. The problem was that, as the Americans had shown on Okinawa, Japanese forces advancing in the open would be annihilated by vastly superior US firepower. And for the invasion of Japan, American planners were mustering the most powerful amphibious force of the war. As a result, US planners estimated their casualties for the decisive phase of the invasion at 126,000. Heavy as the figure may seem, it was no greater than many other battles of the Second World War. Yet the cost of Okinawa continued to haunt many American leaders. After the successful detonation of an atomic device on the 16th of July, they had a new and more powerful weapon with which to break Japanese resolve in a series of shock attacks. Consequently, on the 6th of August, at Hiroshima, the first atomic bomb was dropped. And on the 9th of August, Nagasaki was destroyed by a second atomic weapon. The effect of these events finally convinced Emperor Hirohito to instruct his divided cabinet to end the war. On the 15th of August, Hirohito personally informed a stunned nation that as the war was not progressing in Japan's favor, they must bear the unbearable. On the 2nd of September, aboard the battleship Missouri, Japan officially surrendered to the Allied powers. The collapse of the German campaign in Russia, leading to the occupation of much of Eastern Europe and the Balkans by Soviet forces in 1945, had its roots in events occurring some years earlier. Hitler had studied his history, even though he was inclined to draw fatally unbalanced conclusions from what he read. In the end, it was his intuitive rather than educated guidance of German strategy that lost him the war. He had long known that the Balkans had always spelt trouble, and initially held back from involvement in that glue pot. In 1939, after the conquest and dismemberment of Poland, he entered into the infamous pact with Stalin and turned his attention to France and Britain, his enemies in the West. By midsummer of 1940, it seemed that Nazi Germany had all but won the war and achieved all Hitler's strategic objectives. The swastika flag flew from the North Cape to the Spanish border, and the axis of Germany, Italy and Japan appeared firmly in the ascendant. But even as he received the rapturous plaudits of the crowds in Berlin following the defeat of France, Belgium and Holland and the expulsion of the British Expeditionary Force from the continent, Hitler was already nursing his wish to exterminate the forces of Bolshevism, and the only way to do that was to conquer the Soviet Union. Once this had been achieved by the destruction of the Red Army, Germany would have achieved a long-cherished ambition: the acquisition of vast tracts of territory that could be colonized by Germans, who would work the land and develop its industrial and economic potential using masses of slave labor provided by the Russian rural masses. For this, Hitler needed a secure southern flank, as well as the oil resources of Romania and Hungary. Initially, good German diplomacy seemed to be securing the alliances in Southeast Europe that would guarantee a bloodless campaign, whereby German influence could be firmly secured in the Balkans. But when Mussolini, hoping to match the success of the German march into Czechoslovakia in 1939, sent his army across the Albanian border into Greece in October 1940, Hitler's plans collapsed. The Italians were ignominiously hurled back, and British ground and air elements arrived in mainland Greece, Crete and the Aegean Islands within weeks to support the Greeks. British bombers on Greek airfields were now within range of the vast Romanian oil fields and refineries at Ploiești, one of Hitler's main strategic objectives. Something had to be done. A furious Hitler gave orders for German forces to invade Greece. This was impossible in the face of approaching winter, so Hitler had to turn to emergency diplomacy to buy time as his forces redeployed to southern Europe for a campaign in the spring of 1941. Hungary and Romania were signed up as members of the Axis in November 1940. Bulgaria took more persuasion, being that much closer to the Soviet Union, already rumbling menacingly at the threat of an Axis bulwark on its southwestern approaches. German patience paid off, and the Bulgarians agreed to the entry of German support troops. During the winter months, their engineers were busily preparing assembly areas in southern Bulgaria, from which the Greek invasion would be launched. As spring approached, numerous military bridges were thrown across the Danube, and Bulgaria finally signed into the Axis on the 1st of March 1941, as German combat troops entered the country across the Romanian border, formed up in their deployment areas, and awaited the order to advance into Greece. Until now, Yugoslavia had remained neutral and outside the Axis, although its large Catholic Croat population was inclined to be pro-German. Up to a point, Hitler accepted its government's stance, but demanded unlimited use by the Wehrmacht of the key strategic rail link from Belgrade to Salonika. A reluctant Yugoslav government signed into the Axis on the 25th of March. But a few days later, a coup by officers sympathetic to the Allies forced the pro-German regent, Prince Paul, into exile and placed the 18-year-old King Peter II on the throne, declaring him to be of age. The new Prime Minister, General Simovic, refused to ratify the signature of his predecessor on the Axis Treaty, and a furious Hitler announced on the 27th of March that he would destroy Yugoslavia as both military power and sovereign state. Simovic called on Russia, traditional protector of the Slavs, for help, but received only a bland assurance of friendship and non-aggression. On the 6th of April, the Germans simultaneously invaded Greece and Yugoslavia, which from the start was a divided nation. The Orthodox Serbs loathed the Catholic Croats, and both detested the Muslim Bosnians. Once the country had been occupied by the Germans, these age-old hatreds continued to affect the subsequent guerrilla campaign, making it extremely difficult for the SOE, Special Operations Executive in London, to determine which faction, whether Royalist, Liberal Democrat or Communist, was actually fighting the Germans, and which was preparing to seize political power once the war had ended. The German blitzkrieg, devastatingly supported from the air, quickly overwhelmed Yugoslavia. Pro-German Croat units of the Royal Yugoslav Army mutinied at once, and some actually began to fight Serbs. An armistice was signed on the 17th of April. The Germans had conquered Yugoslavia for the loss of less than 500 men. King Peter and his supporters fled into exile, from which they emerged briefly in 1945, only to be expelled once more by Tito's communist government. The exhausted Greek army that had fought so valiantly against the Italians was forced to capitulate within days of the German intervention, and the British and Empire troops sent to its aid were forced out of mainland Greece, then Crete, with heavy losses of men, ships and material. German troops entered Athens on the 27th of April. Hitler had now secured his southern flank, but the delay caused by the need to invade Yugoslavia and then Greece had fatally interfered with the timetable for invading Russia. The brilliant staff work for which the German army had long been famous was not in itself enough to beat the clock. The invasion of Russia began on the 21st of June, following the major redeployment of forces necessary to bring the conquerors of the Balkans up to the Soviet border. The events of the following 3 years were to prove that Hitler's judgment in launching his forces against the Soviet Union at least a month after they would have stood a good chance of forcing their way through to Moscow in the summer of 1941 proved his and his country's downfall. As it was, the German army came within an ace of taking Moscow, but they arrived on the outskirts of the sprawling city as the grip of winter seized the land. They had not bargained for a winter campaign, and their clothing and equipment were nowhere near adequate for the savagery of the climate. Hitler, remarked Winston Churchill, had failed to notice that Russia had a winter. By 1944, it was clear that Germany could not hope to win the war. The seemingly limitless manpower and industrial resources of the Soviet Union, aided by massive support from the Western Allies, the United States in particular, had ground down the Nazi war machine. Within Germany itself, the adverse trend of the war was beginning to make itself felt. One German eyewitness described a typical scene on a mainline railway station as the troops left for the Netherlands, Belgium and France, carrying cheerful drafts back from home leave, and others departed, bound for the Eastern Front. For those leaving on the westbound trains, there was laughter, affectionate farewells, instructions as to what gifts were to be brought back from Paris on the next leave. For the men departing for the Eastern Front, there was a tense silence and an aura of gloom and foreboding, as wives, mothers and sweethearts bade tearful farewells to men who felt there was scant chance of return. Those left at home faced increasing shortages from mid-1944 as the copious supplies from Normandy and the Low Countries dried up with the steady Allied advance from the Normandy beachheads. By night, the RAF pursued its inexorable bombing campaign against the German cities, and by day, massed formations of American bombers pounded away at pinpoint targets, aiming to destroy the transport and industrial infrastructure of the Third Reich. Until early in 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighters had been able to shoot down hundreds of American bombers. But with the introduction of the long-range Mustang air superiority fighter, whose drop tanks, Rolls-Packard engine and powerful armament enabled it to accompany the lumbering bomber formations into the very heart of the Third Reich, the German fighters were outclassed and driven from the sky. But although the Allied proponents of this remorseless bombardment claimed that it would result in a collapse of German national morale, nothing of the sort happened. A weary populace dug itself out of the ruins every morning and continued to obey the will of the Führer, whose ambitions had created this dire situation. As the Allies wrested mastery of the air from the Luftwaffe, the bombing offensive intensified. It was not directed solely at the German cities, battered as these had become by 1943. Other important strategic targets competed for attention. Prominent among these were the enormous refinery and oil well complexes around the town of Ploiești in Romania, upon which much of the German war economy depended. Germany had no oil supplies of its own, and was reliant on what could be obtained from Russia and the occupied territories, particularly Romania. These provided a third of Germany's oil requirements, even when running at half capacity of 1 million refined tons a month. Their sheer area posed a problem, for they could not be destroyed in a single attack, but had to be totally flattened and put permanently out of commission. As the Allied airmen discovered to their cost, this was virtually impossible. Bombing attacks as early as 1942 had been ineffectual, and it was not until the following year that a considerable force of long-range heavy bombers was available to prosecute a major attack. On the 1st of August 1943, a force of B-24 liberators based in North Africa took off for Ploiești. This was a heavily defended target, surrounded by batteries of guns and protected aloft by 4 groups of Me-109 fighters. Some 200 Italian fighters were based on airfields astride the likely bomber routes to and from the target. Casualties reduced the force as it flew towards Romania. Poor navigation led many aircraft adrift, and one formation is said to have flown low over the capital, Bucharest, one bomber flying low up the city's main thoroughfare. Chaos reigned over the target as different bomber groups tried desperately to avoid mid-air collisions. The anti-aircraft defenses were alert and ready, and a tornado of fire greeted the lumbering bombers as they fought their way into the refinery area. Many, flying at maximum speed no more than 30 feet above the ground, were brought down by other aircraft's delayed action bombs. Harried by fighters and riddled with shot, bombers crashed in all directions. 5 Congressional Medals of Honor were awarded to aircrew in this desperate attempt to destroy the Ploiești complex. Of the original force, over 57 were shot down, and another 11 had to turn back without bombing. Little lasting damage was done to the refineries. The Allied air commanders, meeting in 1944, had tabulated their list of bombing priorities in order to give maximum support for Overlord, the invasion of the continent. The prime target here remained Ploiești as the single largest source of oil fuels. The task was assigned to the American 15th Air Force, which reopened the Ploiești attacks in April 1944. After Berlin and the Ruhr, this was the most heavily defended target in Europe and became known as the Graveyard of the 15th, whose crews bravely went back again and again despite appalling losses. 4 times in April and May, the bombers struck in broad daylight. Great damage was done. Persistence paid off. Ploiești was subjected to further raids through the summer, and finally, after 4 huge attacks in August, each by more than 1,000 bombers, the defences were overwhelmed, and production of refined fuels ended. Over 300 heavy bombers had been lost, together with their 10-man crews. In the end, sheer weight of numbers, the presence of P-51 Mustang fighter escorts, and the waning power of the Luftwaffe's depleted fighter force enabled the Americans to win this desperate aerial battle. From now on, Germany had to rely on its synthetic oil plants. The RAF's Bomber Command turned its attention to these small targets, difficult enough to hit by day, even more so at night. Despite heavy casualties, for the air defences over Germany were still as formidable as ever, these attacks were continued to the end of the war. The winter of 1943-44 had seen a series of defeats for the Wehrmacht. Having been driven out of Africa, it was fighting a dogged rearguard action up the spine of Italy, where Mussolini had been ousted following Italy's capitulation on the 8th of September 1943, but where a prompt reaction by the Germans had seen their forces occupying most of the country within hours of the Italian defection. On the Eastern Front, a series of devastating thrusts by the Red Army, following their destruction of the German 4th and 9th Panzer Armies in the gigantic battle around Kursk in July 1943, had steadily forced the Germans back, despite Hitler's insistence that every bit of Russian soil must be held, and no retreat permitted. Kursk was a landmark, probably the greatest tank battle of all time, and the last great effort by the Germans to break the Soviets by means of massed armoured formations in set-piece battles. At the same time, Hitler, faced with Allied landings in Sicily, then Italy, found that the nightmare of war on several fronts was a reality. Furthermore, the impending threat of an Allied invasion of Europe, the Second Front, was tying down yet more troops. High-quality divisions had been moved to southern Europe to fight the campaign in Italy, and more forces were deployed in Scandinavia, the Low Countries, and the Balkans on occupation duties that frequently involved pitched battles with ever-increasing numbers of assorted partisans and guerrillas. In spite of this drain on their resources, the German generals in the east continued to fight with great skill, inflicting heavy losses on their opponents as they slowly yielded ground. But even after the Allied invasion of France in June 1944 and the subsequent advance towards the Rhine, Hitler was curiously undismayed. He sensed that the Western Allies were finding it hard to agree on the terms demanded in the event of a final victory that now seemed increasingly certain. In January 1943, an Anglo-American summit conference had been held at Casablanca, where Churchill and Roosevelt had declared themselves in favor of unconditional surrender by Germany and its then allies Italy and Japan. Although this kept Stalin, the Soviet leader, happy, he repeatedly voiced his anger that the promised Anglo-American landings in France had not taken place by the end of 1943. He had grounds for this. The Red Army was undeniably bearing the brunt of the war. On the Eastern Front, the numerical odds now favored the Russians. 3 German army groups were confronted by 8 Russian fronts, each more or less the equivalent of an army group. The earlier superiority in equipment enjoyed by the Germans had gone. The Soviet T-34 tank, mass-produced, was designed for operation by hastily trained crews. Simple in construction, it combined armored protection with high mobility and firepower. Its original 76mm gun had been replaced in later marks by a potent 85mm cannon. Although the German Tiger tank was heavier and carried an even bigger 88mm gun, it was heavily outnumbered and prone to mechanical breakdown, although nowhere near to the extent that unreliability was to dog the lighter and more mobile Panther, which entered service from 1943. The earlier German Mark III and IV tanks were now no match for the T-34. The German military logistics system, its Achilles heel, much of it being still horse-drawn, was under extreme strain, operating over extended distances on primitive roads that readily broke up, turning into deeply rutted quagmires in the thaw. These roads and the rickety rail system in the USSR were also under constant risk of attack from partisan forces operating deep in the German rear areas. The Russian pressure was maintained on all sectors of the huge Eastern Front. In January 1944, Leningrad was finally relieved, a great psychological as well as military triumph for Moscow. There was to be no let-up. In the face of remorseless pressure, the whole of the German Army Group North fell back along the Baltic coast. Hitler, alarmed by the turn of events and desperate to keep a hold on the Baltic, training ground for the new generation of U-boats and their crews, sacked and replaced the Northern Army Group's commander, General Kuchler. His successor, Field Marshal Walter Model, had begun his campaigning in Russia in 1941 as a divisional commander, but had gained accelerated promotion through personal bravery, professional competence, and loyalty to his Führer. Although he had experienced serious reverses, notably at Kursk in 1943, his reputation as the Führer's fireman and shield and sword still held good, and he enjoyed the confidence of the troops under his command. Thanks to his efforts, the Soviet advance was stemmed, at least temporarily, on the Polish border, giving time for the Germans to regroup. At the same time, in the south, the Russian 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts broke out across the river Dnieper to savage Manstein's Army Group South. Further south, with its right flank on the Black Sea, Kleist's Army Group A was assailed by the 2nd, 3rd and 4th Ukrainian fronts, under the formidable marshals Konev, Malinovsky and Tolbukin. Odessa fell on the 10th of April 1944. The Russians were now ready to cross into Poland and were already deep into Romania. The last Germans were ejected from the Crimea, and Sevastopol fell on the 12th of May. Field Marshals Manstein and Kleist, who had conducted brilliant fighting withdrawals, were sacked in March 1944 for their pains by an infuriated Hitler. In the case of Erich von Manstein, Hitler made a potentially fatal error. The Germans now reorganized their forces in the southern fronts into army groups North and South Ukraine, under the respective commands of Field Marshals Mödel and Schorner, both regarded as safe Nazi apostles. Neither, however, was in the class of Manstein, whose ability amounted to genius, as with depleted forces he had fought the road back from Stalingrad, inflicting devastating losses on his numerically superior but professionally inferior opponents. Three hammer blows, delivered by the Russians in 1943, had not only cost the Germans huge losses of tanks and other military equipment, but had seriously eroded the morale of their troops. The incidence of self-inflicted wounds and of what is now known as post-traumatic stress rose alarmingly, despite draconian disciplinary measures imposed on Hitler's personal orders, such as drumhead courts-martial with mandatory death sentences. Curiously, there is little evidence to show that Russian soldiers were similarly affected. It seems that they and their officers were more frightened of the consequences of failure than of the enemy. The German General von Mellenthin attributed this to a mixture of iron discipline ruthlessly enforced by officers and political commissars. One cause of the loss of German morale was the self-evident fact that the Soviets appeared to have inexhaustible manpower resources, coupled with the ability to mass-produce munitions of war, particularly tanks, aircraft and artillery. The factories and arsenals producing them were far to the east, far beyond the range of any German bomber, in many cases behind the Ural Mountains, where they had been relocated shortly after the German invasion of 1941. Of the Soviet artillery weapons, the most feared were the Katyushka multiple rocket launcher, or Stalin organ, and the widespread use of mortars. One German soldier describing what it was like to come under fire from a Stalin organ said that it started with the roar of an infuriated beast in the distance, a dull groaning noise, unlike anything else in the world. Then came the creaking of a badly tuned organ. Paralysis descended on the front line and the rattle of machine guns fell silent. Then hell was let loose, as nearly 100 shells burst in the trees or on the ground, creating a deafening thunder, flames, gunpowder, and pieces of copper as big as a fist. Hitler's obsession over not yielding ground had now cost his country dear. Instead of using the spring of 1944 to disengage from the Russians and fall well back to a shorter prepared defensive line, buying time whilst his array of war-winning secret weaponry came online, he persisted in issuing directives denying his able generals the chance to use their superior tactical skills. Time and time again, the superior fighting skills of the Germans defeated the stolidly executed attacks of the Soviet armor and infantry, whose tactics were consistently predictable, being the result of training based on a largely semi-literate peasantry incapable of mastering complex tactical doctrine and limited by the need to follow easily assimilated drills. The new weapons on which Hitler now placed his faith were indeed formidable, at least on paper. The V-1 pilotless aircraft, V-2 ballistic rocket, jet fighter aircraft, and a new generation of fast U-boats would have created immense problems for the Allies had they entered service in quantity in 1944. As it was, delays caused by Hitler's personal intervention in their design and deployment proved fatal for Germany. One example is that of the Messerschmitt 262, the first operational jet fighter in the world. An outstanding potential interceptor, vastly superior in speed to the American P-51 Mustang, it offered a last-minute reprieve in the air defense of Germany. But Hitler's insistence that it be redesigned for the light bomber role led to many months of delay in its entry into service. Once launched at the American bomber formations, it performed sensationally in the hands of aces such as Colonel Galland, who, describing the new sensation of flying with jet propulsion, felt it was as though angels were pushing. Galland, who was one of the outstanding fighter pilots of all time, and subsequently staunch friend of many against whom he had flown, flew the Me-262 successfully against the American bombers. But it was too late. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe's fuel supplies were virtually exhausted, and even though the jets could fly on inferior fuel, similar to diesel, there was a dearth of even that. In any case, the short range and endurance of the Me-262 rendered it useless for support of the army above the battlefield. And in this respect, the Soviets had long held the upper hand. The summer of 1944 saw no easing of the Red Army's pressure. On the 6th of June, the British and Americans had landed in Normandy, drawing further Wehrmacht resources westwards. The 1,200-mile frontage in the east was now held by dangerously thinned-out forces, and at the end of June, the Russians resumed the offensive. Hitler continued to ignore the generals who advised a retirement that would enable the Germans to hold a shorter and stronger line. General Busch of Army Group Center faced the assault of no less than 3 Soviet fronts, under command of the Soviet Deputy Supreme Commander Marshal Zhukov, on a frontage of some 350 miles. In order to achieve overwhelming firepower at the main points of attack, the Russians had massed a staggering 400 guns per mile of front. Behind the German forward positions, thousands of guerrillas attacked administrative units, headquarters and airfields. Not all of these were fighting for Stalin and communism. There were numerous bands of dissident Russians, Ukrainians, Red Army deserters and Cossacks who had initially greeted the Germans' invasion of 1941 as a liberation, but who had rapidly become disillusioned by the conqueror's savage treatment of the civil population. To one such band of guerrillas fell the Soviet Marshal Vatutin, mortally wounded in an ambush when in command of the 1st Ukrainian Front. The Luftwaffe, now short of aircraft, trained aircrew and aviation fuel, was shot out of the sky by overwhelming numbers of Russian fighter aircraft. Advancing Red Army troops were closely supported by masses of fighter bombers, operating as flying artillery to overwhelm any points of resistance. The Ilyushin IL-2, known as the Stormovik, was one of the most significant warplanes to emerge in World War II. Heavily armoured against ground fire and with a two-man crew, it could carry a formidable warload of cannon, rockets and bombs. Almost 25,000 of them were built, and by sheer weight of numbers, they swamped the German ground forces when unleashed against them. Formerly, the Luftwaffe had enjoyed air superiority, destroying hundreds of Sturmovix. The tables had been turned. Earlier in the campaign, Junkers 87 Stuka dive bombers, fitted with powerful cannon, had wrought great execution on Soviet tanks by attacking their vulnerable upper surface armour with cannon fire. But the cumbersome Stukas needed conditions of air superiority and plentiful fighter cover in which to operate. Lacking the close protection of their escorting fighters, they vanished from above the troops who had relied on their support. At the end of August, Zhukov was within easy reach of Warsaw on the Central Front, where the Polish Home Army, loyal to the government in exile in London, rose against the German occupiers in the mistaken belief that the Russians were about to arrive. Elsewhere in Poland, this 300,000-strong army, well organized, had been fighting earlier in the year in support of the Russian advance. Its commander, General Komarovsky, issued a proclamation on the 1st of August, copies of which were printed by the thousand. Addressing the people as soldiers of the city, he issued orders for everyone to fight against the German invader, to take up arms openly to restore the freedom of their country, and to punish the German criminals for the terror and bestiality they had committed within their frontiers. He did so in the belief that the Russians, already within field artillery range, would join in the fight and help in the liberation of the capital. It would have been easy for them to do so, for the Germans in Warsaw were initially taken by surprise, and the Home Army captured many key buildings. Instead, in an act of cynical treachery almost beyond belief, the Russians halted before the gates of the Polish capital, ostensibly to replenish, as the SS and Gestapo went into Warsaw to settle with Komarovsky's gallant citizen soldiers, who as non-communists were left to fight to the death. General Bohr had provisioned for no more than a week's fighting, on the assumption that once it started, the Russians would come to his rescue. There is abundant evidence that whilst the fighting in Warsaw went on, a degree of fraternization existed between German units defending the line of the river Vistula and the Russians on the far bank. It should also be borne in mind that the latter were exhausted by several months of unremitting combat, had greatly overstretched their logistics system, and needed up to a month's respite in which to service worn-out equipment, obtain badly needed reinforcements, and rehearse the inevitable river crossings that lay ahead. In Warsaw itself, the battle reached new levels of savagery, when it became clear to the Poles that their allies were not going to help them. The German officer in charge of the ruthless street-clearing operation, Gruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski of the SS, had his orders. The Poles were to be exterminated. Offers by the British and Americans to fly supplies to the beleaguered Poles were refused by the Soviets, who denied the RAF and the US Air Force the use of airfields on which to refuel. Bach-Zelewski assumed command when the Warsaw Rebellion had been underway for nearly a week, and the Poles were almost, it seemed, on the point of vanquishing the German garrison. So confident, indeed, that the various political factions within the Home Army, gleefully using much captured German equipment, were already beginning to fight each other. The decision to deploy the SS was a conscious one. It freed conventional army units to deploy on the line of the Vistula to face the impending Russian assault, and it was an ominous sign that no quarter was to be given to Komarovsky's army. Bach-Zelewski's SS men were an unsavory mix of Russian ex-prisoners and other turncoats, and convicts from German jails, taking the chance of winning remission through good conduct in battle. They pitched into the home army with merciless gusto. The hellish battle took place in the midst of the luckless civilian population who had been unable to escape from the city. Atrocities, sanctioned personally by Heinrich Himmler, were committed freely against any Pole unlucky enough to get in the way. Even so, the SS found the going tough. The Poles had already been supplied with British weapons and ammunition airdropped earlier in the year, and they now had much captured German equipment. Despite the Russians' bloody-minded refusal to grant refueling facilities, a few RAF aircraft managed to reach Warsaw with small loads and drop them by night to the Poles. As the battle continued, reports of the atrocious behavior of the SS were circulating in the General Staff. Several senior generals, notably Heinz Guderian, actually remonstrated to the Führer, in itself an act of moral courage. Even Bark-Zalewski was uneasy over the barbarism of some of his subordinates. Well may he have been, for it was dawning on many of his kind that the Allies were going to win and would be calling to account any German officers who had been involved with offences against the rules of war. He therefore agreed to meet General Bohr, and a truce was agreed. The fighting had lasted for 2 months. In addition to 15,000 Home Army dead, at least 200,000 civilians had perished. On surrendering, the surviving Poles were, strangely enough, granted prisoner of war status by the Germans and marched off into prison camps that all too soon would be in Russian hands, and from which only a handful would emerge alive. As the Poles fought in vain for their capital, the Russian advance continued to the south. Until the beginning of August 1944, the German Army Group South Ukraine had been granted a quiet summer. It was, however, only a shadow of its former strength. 5 armoured and 4 infantry divisions had been transferred elsewhere, and the remainder had been badly affected by casualties to men and material. To make matters worse, Germany's weaker partners in the Axis were beginning to fall. The Romanians were contemplating changing sides, joining the Russians, and suing the Allies for acceptable peace terms. On the 20th of August, the storm broke. The Russian 2nd Ukrainian Front struck south, as the 4th Ukrainian Front headed west from its bridgeheads on the river Dniester, near Kishinev. The 1st and 4th Ukrainian fronts drove west towards the river Vistula, which they reached at the end of the month, halting on its banks as their logistic tail, left far behind in the precipitate advance, caught up. The respite offered little comfort to what remained of Army Group Centre defending the river line. Behind them lay 250 miles of the plains of Poland, offering little or no comfort to the defenders, but ideal country for the advancing Russians, where massed formations of armoured vehicles could range freely. The next river defence line available to the Germans was that of the Oder, and behind that, a bare 50 miles distant, Berlin itself. The German army was now a shadow of its former self. In dead, wounded, sick and captured, it was to suffer almost 2 million casualties in the year ending December 1944, and the supply of fit men to replace these seasoned troops had dried up. Whole divisions had actually disappeared from the German army order of battle, but Hitler, who refused to acknowledge facts that displeased him, insisted that newly raised divisions of so-called People's Grenadiers bore the designations of those that had been effectively destroyed, mostly in the east. The new formations, lacking heavy weapons or armour and well below the manning levels of those they replaced, were assigned to the German Home Army under command of Heinrich Himmler, chief of the Gestapo or secret police, and now Minister of the Interior, to which post he was appointed after the failure of the assassination attempt on Hitler in July 1944. After his narrow escape from the bomb placed under the conference table at Rastenburg, Hitler became even more paranoid, insisting that only the Nazi salute was to be given and the old one abolished. Despite their growing unease at the way in which the war was being directed by the Führer and his close associates, the General Staff, including Germany's proven soldiers like Guderian, Manstein and their contemporaries, conformed. They were warned of the perils of doing otherwise by the fate of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who, suspected of implication in the assassination attempt, was given the choice of facing a people's court and a degrading execution, or suicide and a soldier's funeral. He took the latter. Hitler still relied for military advice on Field Marshals Keitel and Jodl, respectively Chief and Chief of Staff of the German Armed Forces, or OKW. These lackeys were despised by the rest of the General Staff, whose allegiance to the Nazi Party had long been questionable, but whose failure to curb Hitler and the Nazi Party in the 1930s remains one of the prime causes of what befell their nation and the rest of Europe in the years that followed. As the certainty of eventual German defeat became clear, Hitler's Balkan allies, shakily held together by the tripartite pacts of 1940 and 1941, faltered. The Romanians were the first to crack. Between the wars, they had appeared to be under French influence, but the increasing strength of neo-military far-right parties shifted the allegiance towards Germany. King Carol was deposed in 1940, and power was seized by the pro-German Marshal Antonescu, who took his country into war against Russia in 1941, and continued, unlike some of the other Axis Allied leaders, to enjoy the confidence, even respect, of Hitler to the end. Romania's contribution in the Eastern Campaign exceeded those of Germany's other southern satellites, Hungary and Bulgaria. Romanian casualties were enormous, particularly in the Stalingrad operations, where the Germans cynically used them as cannon fodder. Of the 600,000 Romanians who served in the Axis armed forces, over half were killed. By midsummer 1944, the survivors had been forced back to their own eastern frontier, and at the beginning of August, the Russians were pouring into their country.
On the 23rd of August, a coup led by Prince Michael, who assumed the crown, overthrew Antonescu, who was subsequently executed by the Russians, and Romania immediately changed sides.
The Luftwaffe bombed Bucharest on the following day as the remnants of the Romanian army invaded Hungary in order to recover Transylvanian territory lost in 1940 as the result of the Tripartite Pact. A total of 14 Romanian divisions in varying states of military effectiveness were now placed at the disposal of the Russians, who formed 2 further divisions from their Romanian prisoners and used them, much as had the Germans, as cannon fodder for their advance into the German heartland.
The Russian army entered Bucharest in triumph on the 30th of August 1944. The Romanians were allowed to retain Transylvania, but had to give the Russians back the provinces of Bessarabia and Bukovina, given to them as part of the German-Russian Pact of 1939. As a result of these Balkan convulsions, all German forces in that theatre were now placed at risk, especially those comprising the garrisons of Greece and Yugoslavia, whose escape routes back to Germany were increasingly under attack by partisan forces.
The Bulgarians were the next German ally to fall. They had not, as good Slavs, actually fought against the Russians, but had allowed the Germans to use their country as a staging area for operations elsewhere in the Balkans and against Russia. Their new provisional government asked Russia for terms in September, declared war on Germany, and a left-wing Fatherland Front seized power. The Red Army marched into Sofia on the 18th of October. The hitherto inactive Bulgarian army now deployed in the field alongside the Red Army as it headed off into Yugoslavia, whose capital Belgrade was liberated on the 20th of October. Hungary had been ruled by an authoritarian conservative regime under the regent, Admiral Horthy, since 1920. Having commanded the old Austro-Hungarian navy in World War I, he was naturally inclined towards Germany and had readily allowed Hitler's troops into his country on their way to attack Yugoslavia in 1941. Thus committed to the Axis cause, he agreed to send an initially small detachment to fight the Soviet Union when Hitler invaded the USSR in June that year. It was not long before Hitler demanded further Hungarian troops. These were forthcoming, but lacked experience and equipment. The Hungarians suffered heavily at Voronezh in 1943, and further semi-trained levies were dispatched to the slaughter. Almost half the 350,000 Hungarian troops committed to the Eastern Front were killed.